Open the bag. Let everyone see what kind of thief we hired tonight, Victor Harlan shouted. Annie Brooks stood frozen, one hand still gripping the small brown paper bag against her chest. Mr. Harlan, Annie said, her voice trembling. Please, I can explain. Victor pointed straight at her face. I said open it, now. Annie flinched but did not let go of the bag. Victor stepped closer and shouted, How exactly are you going to explain sneaking around and hiding food? I didn't hide it. He gave a short laugh and looked around the hall, inviting the few people left to understand the kind of employee he had caught. Then what would you call it? Sir, Annie said, struggling to keep her voice steady, I saw the chef getting ready to throw these things into the trash. Victor's eyes narrowed. I didn't touch anything on the guests' tables until after they left, she said. I only took what was left over, sir. Victor laughed once, sharp and cold. Listen to that. She's got her own little rule book for stealing. Annie shook her head quickly. Her fingers tightened around the bag until the paper wrinkled under her hand. I'm sorry, and I hope you understand, but I'm not stealing. The kitchen staff had begun sorting what would be thrown out. So Annie had taken what she thought no one would miss. 4 dinner rolls wrapped in a napkin. 3 apples. 2 pieces of cake from a tray already marked for disposal. Victor had caught her at the side station. Now the bag was in her hand, and her reason sounded small inside the enormous room. I asked you a question, he said. Annie looked frightened. It was going in the trash. That is not your decision. No, sir. And yet you made it. Victor lifted his chin toward the bag. Open it. Annie did not move. His face hardened. Open it, Annie. Victor grabbed the top of the bag and pulled it from her hand. The paper tore slightly under his fingers. He tipped it over the nearest service table himself. The rolls landed first. Then the apples rolled against a stack of plates. 1 slice of cake, wrapped badly in a napkin, slid out last and left a thin streak of frosting on the polished wood. Victor stared at it. There, he said. That is what integrity looks like. When no one is watching. Heat rose behind Annie's eyes. She refused to cry. I'm sorry, sir. They were going to be thrown away, but I wasn't taking them for myself, she said. A voice came from the far end of the hall. What is going on here? Victor stiffened. For one brief second, the color changed in his face. Then he turned quickly, forcing a polite smile onto his mouth. Mr. Whitaker, he said, I apologize. This is an internal matter. We had a temporary worker attempt to steal from the event. Charles Whitaker stood near the wide entrance. Most people there knew his name, though not everyone recognized him at first. Victor turned back toward Annie and pointed at the food on the table. I don't hire people like you, he said. This is restaurant property. Annie looked at the food spread out before her. No, she said quietly. 10 minutes from now, it would have been trash. Not to you. No, she said, lifting her eyes. Not to them. Charles's gaze shifted slightly. He leaned closer. Them? Annie hesitated. Answer me, Victor snapped. Who were you planning to take it to? Then he gave a bitter laugh. What did you think this place was? A charity. Annie raised her head. They weren't for me. Victor was the first to break the silence. That is a touching little performance, but it does not change what you did. You will pay for every item in that bag, and after tonight, you will never work another event in this city again. Annie's hand trembled once, then went still. How much? She asked. Victor smiled. More than you have. Charles finally stepped forward. That's enough. Victor turned slowly, still wearing that careful smile. Mr. Whitaker, I understand how this may look, he said, but we have standards. If I allow one temporary worker to walk out with food, I have to allow everyone to do it. There are procedures. Charles kept his eyes on Annie. She had not moved since he stepped forward. The food lay on the service table between them like evidence from a trial no one had agreed to attend. Standards, Charles said. Yes, sir. Is humiliation one of them? Victor blinked. Excuse me? You heard me. The wedding hall had thinned after midnight, but there were still enough guests and staff left to make the silence heavy. A father of one of the bridesmaids stood with his overcoat folded across his arm. 2 servers had stopped near the kitchen door. A woman from the floral team held a crate of white roses and did not move. Victor adjusted his cuff. I was protecting the property of this establishment. Charles looked at the rolls, the apples, and the container of chicken. From whom? Victor's mouth tightened. From theft. Annie spoke before she could stop herself. I wasn't going to sell it. Victor turned on her. Nobody asked you. I asked her, Charles said. That stopped him. Charles took one step closer to Annie. You said them. Who are they? Annie glanced toward Victor, then toward the open hall doors. 3 people near the bus stop on Marietta, she said. Mr. Samuel, Mrs. Clara, and old Ben. They sleep there most nights unless the police move them along. Annie turned to Charles. They're old. One of them can barely stand. The shelter was full last night. The church basement closed early because the pipes froze. I wasn't taking it to sell. I wasn't taking it home for myself. Victor gave a short laugh. She knows their names now. Annie's face tightened, but she kept going. I've seen them for 2 days. Mr. Samuel keeps coughing. Mrs. Clara can barely hold a cup steady. Ben gives away half of whatever he gets. She swallowed. They're old. They're cold. And I knew this food was going to be thrown out. If this moment touched your heart, please like this video so more people can hear Annie's story. Comment below and tell us where you are watching from. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more emotional and inspiring stories. Charles listened without interruption. Victor leaned toward Charles. Sir, with respect, every person caught doing something wrong has a sad explanation. We cannot run a professional venue on sentiment. No, Charles said. But you also cannot run one on cruelty and call it professionalism. Victor's smile disappeared for a second. I have managed this floor for 9 years. And tonight you used those 9 years to frighten an 18-year-old girl in front of strangers over food you planned to throw away. Charles looked at Annie. First, I want to know your name. What is it? Annie held his gaze for half a second, then lowered her eyes. Annie, sir. Victor lowered his voice. Mr. Whitaker, perhaps we should discuss this privately. You made it public. I was handling misconduct. You were making an example of her. Victor did not answer. Charles turned to one of the kitchen staff standing near the swinging door. What happens to leftover food from an event like this? The young man looked at Victor first. Charles noticed. I'm asking you, Charles said. The young man cleared his throat. Most of it gets tossed, sir. Some has to, some doesn't. But policy says we don't take anything out unless management approves it. And did management approve any donation tonight? No, sir. Was anyone scheduled to pick up the safe leftovers? No, sir. Victor Coutin, because we do not have a certified partner arranged for this event. There are liability concerns, health codes, storage issues. It is not as simple as handing food to whoever is standing outside. Charles nodded once. That may be the first useful thing you've said tonight. Victor seemed relieved for half a breath. Then Charles added, but none of that required you to call her a thief. The relief vanished. Annie lowered her eyes to the food. Charles saw her looking. You are working tonight? He asked. Yes, sir. What shift? Cleanup. 10 to 2. Who hired you? The staffing agency. They call when there's extra work. And you were to be paid tonight? Annie hesitated. Victor answered for her. Pending review? Charles looked at him. That was not the question. Annie's voice was low. Yes, sir. I was supposed to be paid. What would that pay cover? Her fingers curled at her side. Rent for the week. Some bus fare. Victor sighed as if her answer bored him. Mr. Whitaker, I must insist. No, Charles said, turning fully toward him now. You must not. Miss Brooks will be paid for her shift, he said. Victor's jaw tightened. Sir, that sends the wrong message. The wrong message was sent when you turned leftover bread into a public trial. She violated policy. Then write down the policy. I'll read it myself in the morning. Victor's eyes flickered. Of course. And you will not call the police. I wasn't. You said enough for her to believe you might. Annie looked up at that. Charles continued. You will not contact the staffing agency tonight. You will not blacklist her from future work. You will not speak to her again unless human resources is present. Victor stared at him. Human resources? Yes. This is a restaurant floor, sir. Not a courtroom. Charles looked at Annie, then back to Victor. It became a courtroom the moment you demanded she open that bag for an audience. For a moment, Nobody moved. Then Victor took a breath through his nose and nodded, the kind of nod that meant obedience without agreement. "Very well," he said. "If that is what you want." Charles did not accept the performance. "It is." Annie stood unsure what to do now that the storm had changed direction. She wanted to gather the food, apologize again, disappear through the back door, and reach the bus stop before the cold settled deeper. But she also knew leaving too quickly might look like guilt. Life had taught her that poor people had to think about how every movement might be judged. Charles seemed to understand without being told. "Annie," he said, "do you still intend to take this food to them?" Annie answered carefully, "Yes, sir, if I'm allowed." "You are." Charles turned to the kitchen worker. "Bring her a clean container, something with a lid. Add enough safe food for 3 people, and label it with the time it left the kitchen." The young man looked stunned. "Yes, sir." Victor stepped forward. "Mr. Whitaker, I need to object for the record." "There is no record yet," Charles said. "But there will be." Victor stopped. The kitchen worker hurried back through the swinging door. Charles did not ask her to tell her whole story. After a minute, the kitchen worker returned with a white takeout box and a handled paper bag, stronger than the one Annie had brought. Inside were fresh rolls, chicken, fruit, and wrapped pastries. He placed it on the table without looking at Victor. Annie touched the edge of the bag. "Thank you." The young man gave her a quick nod. "Yes, ma'am." Charles saw her gather herself. "Do you have a way home?" he asked. "I'm not going home first." "To the bus stop?" "Yes, sir. It's cold." "I know." He studied her for a moment. "Will they be there?" "I hope so." Not yes, not they promised. Just hope, because people living outside could be moved, chased, arrested, or gone by morning without anyone asking where. Charles reached into his coat and took out a business card. He did not press money into her hand. "If there is any problem with your pay, call this number tomorrow." Annie looked at the card, then at him. "Why are you doing this?" The question was honest, almost suspicious. He said only, "Because food meant for the trash should never cost someone their name." Annie did not know what to say to that. She picked up the bag with both hands. Victor stood rigid near the table. Charles stepped aside so Annie could pass. She walked toward the exit with the bag held close, not like stolen property, but like a promise she still meant to keep. When the outer doors opened, winter air rushed into the hall. Annie slipped into it without looking back. Charles watched her disappear into the night. Then he turned toward Victor. "In the morning," he said, "I want the waste records for the last 6 months. The staffing reports for temporary workers, and every written policy you used to justify what happened here." Victor's face lost the last of its color. 6 months? Charles picked up the torn piece of Annie's original paper bag from the service table. "Yes," he said, 6 months. And for the first time that night, Victor Harlan looked afraid. Victor did not answer right away. He looked at the torn piece of paper bag in Charles's hand, then at the empty doorway where Annie had disappeared into the cold. For the first time that night, he seemed to understand that the problem had grown larger than a few rolls and apples. "I'll have the records prepared," Victor said, though his voice no longer carried the same confidence. "Prepared," Charles repeated, "not edited." Victor's mouth opened, then closed. Charles folded the torn piece of paper once and placed it into his coat pocket. He did not know why he kept it. Perhaps because it felt like evidence of something bigger than policy. Perhaps because Eleanor had always kept small things other people threw away. A church bulletin with a handwritten prayer, a thank you note from a housekeeper, a ribbon from a charity luncheon where she said the speeches were too long and the soup was too cold. "Good night, Mr. Harlan," Charles said. Victor nodded stiffly. "Good night, sir." Charles walked out of the hall without another word. The warmth of the building followed him only as far as the front doors. Outside, the winter air struck his face. Atlanta was not a northern city, but cold had a way of finding the poor first. It slipped under thin coats, through worn shoes, into bus shelters and alley corners where men and women held coffee cups with both hands long after the coffee was gone. His driver, Martin, stepped out of the black sedan parked near the curb. "Home, Mr. Whitaker?" Charles looked down the street. Annie was already half a block away, walking fast with the handled paper bag pressed against her side. She was not walking like someone escaping with stolen goods. She was walking like someone afraid she might arrive too late. "Not yet," Charles said. Martin followed his eyes. Would you like me to pull around? No, stay here. Charles began walking. He kept a careful distance, close enough to see where she went, far enough not to frighten her. A 50-year-old white man in a tailored coat following an 18-year-old black girl after midnight was not a harmless picture in America, no matter what his intention was. Eleanor would have told him that. She had taught him that kindness without awareness could still wound. So he stayed back, hands in his coat pockets, moving slowly beneath the streetlights. Annie crossed at the corner and headed toward Marietta Street. The wedding hall behind him still glowed with clean windows and warm chandeliers. Ahead, the city changed block by block. The sidewalks grew narrower, storefronts darkened. A liquor store sign buzzed above a locked door. A bus bench stood under a cracked plastic shelter, its advertisement peeling at one corner. 3 figures were gathered there. Charles stopped across the street. Annie approached them, and the oldest man lifted his head first. He wore a brown coat that looked too large for his shoulders and a knit cap pulled low over his ears. Even from where Charles stood, he could see the man cough into a scarf and turn away so the others would not catch it. "Baby girl," the man said, his voice rough but warm. "You made it back." "I told you I would, Mr. Samuel." A woman beside him sat wrapped in 2 blankets, one gray and one faded red. Her hands trembled when she reached for the bag, but she did not take it until Annie nodded. "Lord, child, your fingers are ice." "I'm fine, Mrs. Clara. You always say that when you're not." Old Ben sat on the ground with his back against the shelter wall. He said nothing at first. He only looked at Annie, then at the bag, then down the street behind her, checking the shadows like a man who had learned trouble could follow food. "Nobody gave you trouble?" he asked. Annie hesitated just long enough for all 3 of them to know the answer. Mr. Samuel's face changed. "Who was it?" "It's Handled." "That ain't what I asked." Annie tried to smile, but it did not hold. "A manager." He thought I was stealing. Mrs. Clara's hand went still on the edge of the bag. "For bringing food nobody wanted?" "That's what I said." Old Ben muttered something Charles could not hear. Annie lowered herself onto the bench beside Mrs. Clara and opened the bag. Steam rose faintly from the chicken container. That small warmth seemed to change the whole shelter. She passed the rolls first, then the apples, then the chicken, careful to give Miss Samuel the softest bread and Mrs. Clara the napkin wrapped around the pastries so her fingers would not stick to the icing. "You eat too," Mrs. Clara said. "I had something earlier." "No, you didn't." Annie looked down. "Take yours." Mrs. Clara tore one roll in half and pushed part of it back into Annie's hand. "Your grandmother raised you to lie better than that?" Annie froze at the mention of her grandmother. Then she gave a tired laugh, the kind that almost became tears but stopped just in time. "No, Mom." "Then eat." She did. Charles watched from across the street as 4 hungry people divided food with more grace than most banquet rooms ever managed. No one grabbed. No one complained. Old Ben broke his pastry and gave the larger piece to Mr. Samuel. Mr. Samuel protested, then coughed too hard to win. Mrs. Clara took small bites and closed her eyes, as if the sweetness carried a memory. Annie ate last. That was what undid Charles. Not the accusation in the hall, not Victor's cruelty, not even the waste. It was the way Annie waited until everyone else had something before she allowed herself a bite. He had seen Eleanor do that for years, at family tables, church suppers, fundraisers, hospital rooms. She would serve everyone, then sit with the smallest portion as if it had simply happened that way. A memory rose so clearly he had to close his eyes. Eleanor sat by a hospital window, a blanket over her knees, her body thinner than she would admit. Snow had been falling that day, though not in Atlanta. They had gone north for treatment because Charles believed money could still purchase one more answer. On the small table beside her was a cup of broth she had barely touched. "You're not eating," he had said. "Neither are you." "I'm not the patient." "No," she said, looking out the window. "You're the man trying to control what can only be carried." He had not liked that. Grief had already made him sharp before she was gone. "I can move you to another hospital." She smiled faintly. "Charles, I can call Dr. Henley again." "Charles, you can still be kind," she said. The words silenced him. She reached for his hand. Her fingers were cool, but her grip remained steady. "Promise me something." "Anything." That's a dangerous word from a businessman. He tried to smile. Failed. She looked at him with the tired patience that had always made him feel both loved and corrected. Don't let losing me make you smaller. Pain does that if you let it. It closes all the doors and tells you that your sorrow is the only sorrow in the world. He looked away. Listen to me, she said. He did. Sometimes the things that mean nothing to us are everything to someone else. A coat, a meal, 5 minutes of respect. Don't forget that just because I'm not there to remind you. He had promised. For a while, he had kept it. Then months became years. Charity became paperwork. Meetings replaced visits. He signed checks, but stopped looking people in the eye. It was easier that way. Less painful. Less human. Across the street, Annie wrapped the empty container back into the bag so it would not blow away. Mrs. Clara touched her sleeve and said something Charles could not hear. Annie nodded, but her face was turned slightly aside. Charles knew that look. It was the look of someone trying to be strong in front of people who needed her strong. Martin had driven slowly up behind him and parked near the curb. He stepped out but kept his distance. Sir? Charles did not look away from the bus shelter. She told the truth, he said. Martin followed his gaze. Yes, sir. Charles touched the folded paper in his pocket. Tomorrow morning, call Elaine in legal. Then call operations. I want every food disposal policy from every property we own. Martin paused. Every property? Everyone. And Mr. Harlan? Charles watched Annie stand, brush crumbs from her coat, and make sure each of the 3 older people had kept something for later. Mr. Harlan is no longer the center of this, Charles said. He is only the first door we open. Annie turned away from the bus shelter and began walking alone into the cold. This time Charles did not follow. He had seen enough to know what kind of person she was, and more than enough to know what kind of man he had stopped being. By 7 the next morning, Charles Whitaker was already in his office on the 23rd floor, standing by the window with a cup of coffee he had not touched. Atlanta moved below him in lines of headlights and pale winter sun. Office workers hurried with collars raised. Delivery trucks backed into alleys. Somewhere in that same city, Annie Brooks was likely waking from too little sleep, wondering whether her name had already been passed from one staffing agency to another with the word trouble attached to it. Charles had seen that happen before. Not to people in his circles, to people who lived close enough to the edge that one accusation could erase a week's pay, one manager's complaint could close 3 doors, one missed shift could become an eviction notice. Martin called from the outer office. Elaine Porter is here. Zentaren. Elaine Porter entered with a legal pad under one arm and reading glasses hooked to the collar of her coat. She was in her early 60s, sharp-eyed, calm, and one of the few people in Charles's company who told him the truth without polishing it first. Eleanor had liked her for that. You sounded serious last night, Elaine said. I was. That usually means expensive. Maybe necessary. She sat without waiting to be invited. Tell me. Charles told her everything, not as a dramatic story, but in order. The wedding, the food, Victor Harlan, Annie Brooks, the open bag, the old people near the bus stop, and the way safe leftovers were being thrown out with no donation partner in place. Elaine did not interrupt. She wrote only a few words. Temp worker, public accusation, wage threat, food waste, possible discrimination. When he finished, she tapped her pen once against the pad. First question. Did anyone call the police? No. Good. Second. Did Mr. Harlan threaten not to pay her? Yes. Bad. I told him she would be paid. That fixes part of the harm, not the behavior. Elaine looked up. Third. Did he use language that could be interpreted as racial bias? Charles held her gaze. He said, Girls like you always have a story. Elaine's mouth tightened. That will matter. I want the records. You'll get them. But records have a way of becoming tidy when people know you're looking. I told him not to edit anything. Elaine gave him a dry look. I'm sure that frightened dishonesty right out of the building. For the first time that morning, Charles almost smiled. That's why you're here. She leaned back. We pull waste logs, shift reports, payroll notes, agency communications, HR complaints, surveillance footage, and vendor agreements. We also find out whether any employee ever requested a food recovery partnership and got shut down. Can we legally donate prepared food? Yes, if handled correctly. Temperature control, labeling, pickup time, approved partners. It is not impossible. People pretend it is impossible, because throwing food away is easier. Charles looked out the window again. Eleanor said that years ago. I remember. Elaine's voice softened a little. She tried to start something after the Midtown Conference Center opened. Charles turned back. What happened? Elaine paused just long enough for him to notice. Operations buried it. The words were plain, but Charles felt them land in the room. Who? At the time? Several people. Some are gone. Some are not. The argument was liability and cost. Eleanor pushed. Then she got sick, and the proposal lost its champion. Charles looked down at his untouched coffee. I was her husband. I should have been champion enough. Elaine did not comfort him. That was another reason Eleanor had liked her. Then be useful now. By 8:30, the first records began arriving, not from Victor directly, but through department heads who had received Elaine's request with legal language attached. Charles sat at the conference table with Elaine, Martin, and Denise Carter from Employee Relations, a black woman in her late 40s who had worked her way from front desk clerk to senior staff advocate over 20 years. Denise knew the properties from the inside. She knew which managers smiled for executives and punished housekeepers when the elevators closed. Denise read the first staffing file and exhaled through her nose. Annie Brooks. Age 18. Temporary event cleanup. Good attendance. No prior incident notes. None? Charles asked. None. 3 compliments, actually. Denise slid the page across. One from a banquet captain. Says she stayed late after a charity luncheon and fixed the chair sashes because the room looked uneven. Elaine glanced at Charles. Design eye. Charles remembered Annie in the hall, humiliated beside rolls and apples. What else? Denise turned another page. She has been taking short shifts across 4 properties. Laundry support, dish room, event breakdown, floor cleanup. Never full-time, so no benefits. Paid through agency. Convenient, Elaine said. Common, Denise replied. Convenient too. Martin entered another report into the shared screen. Waste disposal totals filled the monitor in columns. Pounds of prepared food discarded after weddings, corporate dinners, galas, and holiday parties. Some numbers were estimates, others rounded so neatly they looked invented. Charles read the totals twice. This is 6 months? For this property only, Martin said. Denise's voice was flat, and they're undercounting. Elaine looked at her. How do you know? Because I've seen these events. A wedding for 300 people does not produce 12 pounds of leftovers unless the guests ate the plates. Charles leaned back. The room went quiet. At 9:15, Victor Harlan arrived with 2 binders, and the expression of a man prepared to appear cooperative. He wore a navy suit and carried himself as though the previous night had been an inconvenience caused by others. Mr. Whitaker, he said. Miss Porter, I brought everything requested. Elaine smiled without warmth. Wonderful. We also requested digital copies directly from the property system. Victor's hand tightened on one binder. Of course. Charles gestured to the chair across from him. Sit down. Victor sat. Before we discuss records, Charles said, was Miss Brooks paid? Victor blinked. Payroll is processed weekly. That was not my question. Victor glanced at Denise, then back to Charles. An emergency payment can be issued. Has it been? I can make sure. Has it been? No, sir. Charles looked at Martin. Issue it before this meeting ends. Martin stood and left. Victor cleared his throat. With respect, sir, rushing payment after a policy violation could be viewed as rewarding misconduct. Denise spoke before Charles did. Or correcting wage retaliation. Victor turned to her with a tight smile. Denise, I don't think that is fair. She did not smile back. Fair was not what you were worried about last night. Elaine opened the first binder. Mr. Harlan, how many times in the past year have temporary workers been removed from events for taking leftover food? I don't have that number memorized. Estimate, maybe 5. Denise checked a sheet. 11 written notes, likely more verbal. Victor frowned. Those were separate incidents. Were any of those workers white? Denise asked. Victor's face changed by a fraction. I don't track employees that way. No, she said. People rarely write down the part they know is ugly. Elaine raised a hand slightly. keeping the room from turning into a fight. We will review the files. Charles watched Victor. He had seen men like him in boardrooms and hotel kitchens alike. Men who confused authority with worth. Men who became polite only when someone more powerful entered the room. Eleanor had called them small locked doors. "Tell me about the donation policy," Charles said. Victor sat straighter. "We do not currently release prepared event food to unscheduled third parties." "Why?" "Liability, food safety, brand protection." "Who approved that?" "It has been standard practice for years." "Who approved it?" Victor hesitated. "Operations. Names. I would need to check." "Check." Elaine turned another page. "I see here a request from a kitchen supervisor 4 months ago asking whether leftovers could be donated to Street Marks Community Kitchen." Victor shifted. "That was not feasible. You wrote, 'We are not in the business of feeding the street.' Is that accurate?" The room stilled. Victor looked at the binder, then at Charles. That was an internal shorthand, poorly phrased. Denise's jaw tightened. "Poorly phrased." Charles said nothing for several seconds. When he did speak, his voice was quiet. "My wife once asked this company to build a food recovery program. I was told it faded because of liability. Now I am reading that a supervisor asked again, and your response was contempt." Victor's face had gone pale. "Sir, I never intended. Intent is what people hide behind when impact is standing in front of them." No one moved. Martin returned and placed a note beside Charles. "Emergency payment issued to Annie Brooks. Confirmation sent." Charles nodded once. Victor looked smaller now, but Charles felt no satisfaction. One payment did not repair humiliation. One meeting did not feed the people under the bus shelter. One reprimand did not bring Eleanor back or excuse the years he had let her work become memory instead of policy. Elaine closed the binder. "We need surveillance footage, unedited. We need agency communications. We need every disciplinary note involving food removal, wage withholding, or event blacklisting. Today." Victor swallowed. "Yes, ma'am." Charles stood. The others stood with him except Victor, who rose a second late. "Mr. Harlan, until this review is complete, you are relieved of floor authority. You will not supervise temporary workers, kitchen staff, or event cleanup. You will report directly to Denise for administrative requests only." Victor stared. "You're suspending me? I am removing your access to people you have shown you cannot treat with dignity." Victor's lips pressed together. "And Miss Brooks?" Charles looked toward the window, where the city had brightened but not warmed. "Miss Brooks will be contacted today, not by you." After Victor left, Elaine gathered her notes. "You know this won't stay quiet." "No," Charles said. "It shouldn't." Denise studied him for a moment. "What are you planning?" Charles touched the folded scrap of Annie's paper bag in his pocket. "First," he said, "I want to know who Annie Brooks was before this company taught her to keep her head down." Denise nodded slowly. "Then we start with the agency. Her school records if she agrees. And anyone here who actually saw her work." Charles looked at the waste totals on the screen, then at Eleanor's photograph on the shelf near his desk. "Do that," he said, "and find me Street Marks Community Kitchen." By noon, Annie Brooks had already washed 2 loads of hotel linens, scrubbed a coffee stain out of a hallway carpet, and checked her phone 6 times without meaning to. The emergency payment had come through at 10:42 a.m. She had stared at the notification for nearly a full minute in the laundry room, one hand still resting on a cart of folded towels. The amount was correct. No deduction, no punishment, no mysterious fee for damaged reputation or stolen bread, just the pay she had earned. She should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt unsteady. People like Victor did not lose their grip easily. They let go in front of powerful men, then found quieter ways to make a person pay. Annie knew that. Her grandmother had known it too. "Folks don't always slam doors, baby," Grandma Rose used to say. "Sometimes they just stop opening them." Annie put the phone back into her pocket and returned to the towels. Work was safer than hope. Towels had corners, sheets had folds. Floors got clean if a person kept scrubbing. Hope did not behave that way. Just after 1, her supervisor at the laundry desk called her name. "Annie, there's somebody here to see you." Annie's stomach tightened. Who? Woman from corporate, Denise Carter. For a second, Annie considered pretending she had clocked out early. Denise Carter stood when Annie entered. She was dressed in a gray coat and low heels, with a leather folder under one arm. Her face was serious but not cold. Beside her on the table sat 2 cups of coffee and a paper bag from a bakery. Miss Brooks? Denise asked. Yes, ma'am. I'm Denise Carter. Employee Relations. I'm not here to discipline you. Annie did not sit. That's what people usually say before they do. Denise looked at her for a moment, then nodded. Fair enough. I'm here because Mr. Whitaker asked me to speak with you. Not about blaming you, about understanding what happened and what should happen next. Annie's fingers tightened around the back of a chair. Am I losing my shifts? No. The agency? They have been told not to remove you from the schedule because of last night. If anyone says otherwise, call me. Denise slid a business card across the table. And before you ask, yes, your pay was issued. I saw. Good. Annie finally sat, but only at the edge of the chair. Denise opened the folder. I need your permission before I ask anything personal. You can refuse to answer. You can stop the conversation. You can ask for someone else to be present. That surprised Annie more than the coffee. Okay, she said carefully. Denise's voice softened. How old are you? 18. You live alone? Annie paused. Yes. No family nearby? No. Denise did not rush to fill the silence. Annie appreciated that. Most people heard no family, and immediately wanted a story, preferably one that made them feel wise when they said sorry. My grandmother raised me, Annie said after a moment. She passed last spring. I'm sorry. Annie nodded once, accepting the words without leaning on them. Denise glanced at the page. You studied design? Annie's eyes lifted. Who told you that? You listed Atlanta Community Arts College on an old agency form. First-year student. Fashion and event design concentration. That was before your grandmother got sick? Annie looked toward the break room window. It faced an alley where delivery vans backed in and out all day. She needed medicine, then more appointments, then someone to sit with her. School didn't fit anymore. Did you withdraw officially? I filled out the form. Annie gave a small shrug. I told myself I'd go back the next semester. But you didn't. No, Mom. Denise closed the folder halfway. Mr. Whitaker asked me to find out who you were before last night. Annie's jaw tightened. Before I was caught with a bag? Before a manager decided that bag was the only thing worth knowing about you. Annie looked down at her hands. There was a thin burn mark near her thumb from a catering tray 2 weeks earlier. Her nails were short and uneven. She used to paint them pale blue before critiques at school because Grandma Rose said a girl presenting her work should feel like she belonged in the room. Annie had not painted them since the funeral. I don't know what he wants from me, she said. Maybe nothing. Men like him always want something. Denise did not argue. Sometimes. And sometimes people with power need to be watched while they try to do the right thing. That made Annie look at her. Denise smiled a little. I work in employee relations, honey. Trust is not my hobby. For the first time that day, Annie almost laughed. Denise pushed the bakery bag toward her. I brought a biscuit. You don't have to eat it. Annie stared at it, then shook her head. I'm okay. No, you're polite. That's different. The sentence sounded so much like Mrs. Clara that Annie looked away quickly. Denise noticed, but did not press. Can I ask about the people at the bus stop? Annie folded her hands. What about them? Are they safe? No one outside in winter is safe. Denise accepted that. Do they need medical help? Mr. Samuel does. He coughs all night. Mrs. Clara's hands shake. Ben won't say what he needs. Annie's voice lowered. He was in the army. I think he still thinks asking makes him weak. Denise wrote that down. Annie frowned. Are you going to send police? No, I'm going to call Street Mark's community kitchen and a street outreach nurse, if you agree. They won't force them into anything? They'll offer help, food, blankets, maybe a clinic appointment. No one gets dragged. Annie studied her face. Why? Because you told the truth. Annie did not know what to do with that. Truth had never been enough by itself. Truth needed someone willing to carry it into a room where lies had better shoes. Across town, Charles sat with Elaine and Martin in a smaller conference room, reading the second stack of files. By then they had confirmed 3 things. Annie had no history of theft. Victor had written more disciplinary notes against Black and Latino temporary workers than any other manager in the property, and safe leftover food had been discarded after every major event for at least 6 months, often while local shelters requested support by email. Elaine removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. This is not negligence, this is culture. Charles kept reading. A culture can be changed. Yes, but people who benefit from it will call the change an attack. They can call it what they like. Martin placed another page in front of him. This came from the staffing agency, Annie's references. Charles read the first note. Punctual, quiet, hard worker, good with detail. The second came from a banquet captain at another hotel. She notices colors and layouts. Fixed a table arrangement mistake before the client saw it. The third was handwritten and scanned badly. It was from a woman named Margaret Ellis, senior event designer, who had seen Annie sketching during a break after a bridal expo. Charles read that one twice. Miss Brooks has an eye, Margaret had written. Not trained enough yet, but real. She sees proportion, fabric, and light. I told her to come by the design office if she ever returned to school. Charles looked up. Where is Margaret Ellis now? Martin checked his tablet. Still with us. Event design. Midtown property. Set a meeting. Elaine watched him. With Margaret? With Margaret. With Denise. And eventually with Annie, if Annie agrees. Elaine leaned back. Be careful. I am. No, Charles, you're moved. That is not the same thing. Do not turn this girl into a monument to your guilt. The words were sharp enough to be useful. Charles looked at Eleanor's photograph on the shelf. I don't want to give her charity. Good, because she may not want it. I want to give her a door. Elaine was quiet for a moment. Then make sure there is a room behind it. Training. Pay. Schedule. Protection from people who will say she only got there because she was pitied. Charles nodded. Write it down. Martin's phone buzzed. He read the message. Denise says Annie is willing to speak again, but not today. She has another shift tonight. Charles looked at the page with Margaret's note. Where? Dish room, Northside Banquet Center, 6 to midnight. Charles closed the folder. Cancel it. Elaine raised an eyebrow. He corrected himself. Offer to cover the shift pay and give her the night off. No pressure. Martin typed quickly. A minute later, the reply came. Martin looked up. She said no. Charles almost smiled. Of course she did. She said, I don't get paid to rest. Elaine pointed her pen at Charles. There is your first lesson about Annie Brooks. Charles looked again at the handwritten note about fabric and light. No, he said quietly. I think that is the second. That evening, Annie arrived at the Northside Banquet Center 15 minutes early and tied on a clean apron. She had refused the paid night off because accepting money for not working felt too close to becoming someone's sad story. Still, as she rinsed plates under hot water, she found herself thinking of Denise's card in her pocket, the emergency payment in her account, and the way Charles Whitaker had not handed her cash in the hall. He had given her permission to finish what she had set out to do. That was different, near the end of the shift, when the kitchen slowed and the dishwasher hummed steadily. Annie pulled a folded piece of paper from her bag. It was an old sketch she had carried for months, a wedding dress with a simple waist, soft sleeves, and pale blue stitching along the hem. At the bottom, in small letters, she had written, For Grandma, when I make it back. She looked at it for only a few seconds before folding it away. Hope still felt dangerous, but for the first time in a long while, it did not feel impossible. The next morning, Annie found Denise Carter's card still in the pocket of her coat. She had taken it out twice before dawn, stared at the phone number, then put it back without calling. Help was a strange thing when it came from people connected to the same building where she had been shamed. It could be real, or it could be another hallway leading to a locked door. She left her rented room before sunrise. The radiator had clanked all night without giving much heat, and the window above the sink had a line of frost along the inside edge. Annie dressed in layers, a black sweater, her work shirt, the thin coat she had mended twice at the cuff. Before leaving, she opened the shoebox under her bed and checked the envelope where she kept rent money. The emergency payment had bought her one more week. She closed the box carefully, as if sudden movement might make the money disappear. On the bus, she sat near the back and watched Atlanta pass in gray morning light. Men in work boots stood at stops with lunch bags. A woman in scrubs slept against the window with her phone still in her hand. Two older ladies spoke quietly about a church breakfast that had run out of eggs before everyone was served. Annie listened without meaning to. Hunger had a way of showing up in ordinary conversation, hidden behind jokes and small complaints. By 9, she was at the laundry facility again, feeding sheets into the press. The heat from the machine warmed her hands, but her mind kept drifting. Charles Whitaker had asked for records. Denise had asked about her life. Someone had read old notes from her school forms. People with offices were moving papers around, and Annie did not know whether those papers would protect her or expose her. Near lunch, her phone buzzed. The number was unfamiliar. She let it ring twice before answering. "Hello? Miss Brooks? This is Margaret Ellis. I'm an event designer with Whitaker Hospitality." Annie stopped beside a cart of towels. "Yes, ma'am. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time. I'm on break in a few minutes. I can call back." "No, it's all right." There was a pause. Then Margaret said, "I don't know if you remember me. We met after the Bridal Expo last year. You were sketching near the service hallway." Annie remembered at once. A woman with silver hair, black glasses, and a tape measure around her neck had looked over Annie's shoulder and said, "That hemline needs air." Annie had been embarrassed until Margaret took the pencil and showed her how to open the skirt with 2 lighter lines. "I remember," Annie said. "I saw one of your sketches then. I told you to come by the design office sometime. I couldn't. I know a little more now." Margaret did not make the words heavy. "Mr. Whitaker asked whether I would be willing to meet with you. Only if you want to. No pressure. No promises you did not ask for." Annie looked through the small window in the break room door. Workers moved past with carts, gray uniforms, tired shoulders. What kind of meeting? A conversation. About design, about work, maybe about school, if that is still something you want. Annie almost said it was not. That would have been easier. A closed dream could not disappoint her. Instead, she said, "I don't have a portfolio anymore. Do you have drawings?" "A few." "Then you have a beginning." Annie lowered her eyes. "Why is everybody suddenly interested in me?" Margaret was quiet long enough for the question to be treated with respect. "Because someone mistreated you in a room where people should have known better. But I am calling because I remember your eye. Those are different things." Annie pressed her thumb against the edge of Denise's card in her pocket. "I work tonight." "Then not tonight. Tomorrow afternoon, 30 minutes. Lobby of the Midtown property. Public place. You can leave whenever you want." That detail mattered. Public place. 30 minutes. Leave whenever you want. Annie heard Denise in it. "All right," she said. After the call, Annie stood in the narrow break room until someone knocked on the door and asked if she was done. She went back to the laundry press, but her hands moved slower. She had spent months telling herself she did not miss design because missing it hurt too much. Now a woman who knew the difference between pity and proportion wanted to see her drawings. Across the city, Charles sat in a meeting that had already lasted too long. Elaine Porter had spread files across the table. Denise Carter had added employee statements. Martin had projected charts showing food waste by property, event size, and season. The numbers were worse when seen together. Holiday parties, corporate awards, dinners, wedding receptions, fundraisers for charities that fed the poor, followed by dumpsters full of untouched meals behind the building. Elaine tapped one report. "This is the part that will make people defensive. They will say donation is complicated." "It is complicated," Denise said. "So is payroll. So is liquor licensing. So is valet parking. We manage those because rich guests expect them." Charles looked at the chart without speaking. Martin said, "Street Mark's Community Kitchen can meet this afternoon. Their director, Reverend Paul Green, has been asking for a consistent food partner for years." "Set it." "Already did. 3 o'clock. Elaine glanced at Charles. "You move fast when guilt is driving." Charles did not deny it. "Is that a problem?" "It can be. Guilt wants a grand gesture. Justice needs maintenance." Denise nodded. "A food program is not just a press release. It needs drivers, packaging, temperature logs, training, pickup windows, someone to answer the phone when the plan fails at midnight. Then we build that, Charles said. And Victor? Elaine asked, still suspended from floor authority. His attorney called. Charles looked up. Of course he did, Elaine said. He claims you are making him a scapegoat. Charles leaned back. He made himself visible. Denise folded her hands. Visible is not the same as alone. Some of what he did was his choice. Some of it was tolerated because it kept the floor moving and costs down. That was the sentence Charles did not want but needed. At 3, Charles went to Street Marks. The church sat between a closed hardware store and a barber shop with a hand-painted sign. Reverend Green met him in the basement kitchen, wearing a cardigan over his clerical shirt. He was in his late 60s, with tired eyes and a handshake that did not try to impress anyone. Mr. Whitaker, he said, we've written to your company before. I know. Didn't get far. I know that too. The Reverend studied him. Then why now? Charles looked at the long tables stacked with plastic bowls, the industrial coffee urn, the donated coats folded by size near the wall. Because last night one of my managers humiliated a young woman for trying to do what my company should have done years ago. Reverend Green did not soften. Humiliation feeds nobody. No. But it opened a file I should have opened before. The older man nodded once, accepting the answer but not praising it. We can take food if it's safe. We can distribute same day. We need notice, labels, and consistency. People don't eat promises. Charles almost smiled at that. My legal team will like you. They usually don't. They walked through the kitchen. A volunteer in her 70s stirred soup in a pot large enough to bathe a child in. Another man labeled paper bags with black marker. There was no glamour, no ribbon cutting, no donor wall big enough to hide behind. Just work. Charles thought of Annie at the bus shelter, dividing roles in the cold. How soon could you start? He asked. Reverend Green looked at him. How soon can you stop throwing food away? By evening, Annie finished her shift and walked toward the bus stop with her sketchbook tucked under her coat. She had brought it with her after Margaret's call, though she did not know why. At Marietta, she stopped near the old shelter. Mr. Samuel was there with Mrs. Clara, but old Ben was missing. Where's Ben? Annie asked. Mrs. Clara took her hand. Outreach folks came by. Said they could get him a clinic bed for the night. He fussed, naturally. Mr. Samuel chuckled, then coughed. Told them he wasn't going unless they checked on me too. And did they? Tomorrow morning. He looked at Annie. That lady you sent, Denise. She don't play. I didn't send her, Annie said. Mrs. Clara smiled. Maybe not. But you opened the road. Annie sat beside them for a while. She did not have food tonight, only 2 granola bars from the laundry vending machine. They split them anyway. Mrs. Clara noticed the corner of the sketchbook under Annie's coat. You drawing again? Annie looked down. Maybe. Good, Mrs. Clara said. Hands that only scrub. Forget what they were made for. Annie did not answer. She held the sketchbook tighter as a bus hissed to a stop nearby, its doors folding open to a wash of warm light. For once, she let herself imagine stepping into a room where she was not there to clean up after other people's dreams, but to shape something of her own. Then the thought scared her, and she tucked it away. Still, she carried it home. The next afternoon, Annie arrived at the Midtown property 20 minutes early and spent 15 of those minutes across the street, pretending to study the traffic. The hotel stood behind glass doors polished so clean they reflected the whole block back at her. Men in suits walked in without slowing down. Women in wool coats stepped from cars while bellmen opened doors and called them ma'am with practiced warmth. Annie had entered places like that through loading docks, service elevators, and kitchen corridors. She knew the smell of bleach behind the ballroom walls, the weight of wet linens, the ache in the wrists after stacking 200 chairs. She did not know how to walk through the front entrance without feeling as though someone would stop her. Her sketchbook was tucked under her coat. At 2 minutes before the hour, she crossed the street. The doorman, an older black man with silver eyebrows and a kind face, opened the door. Afternoon, miss. Annie paused. Afternoon. No one asked for her employee badge. No one pointed her toward the back. The lobby opened around her with marble floors, low chairs, winter flowers in tall vases, and a fireplace built more for comfort than heat. She spotted Margaret Ellis near a window. Standing with a coffee in one hand and a folder in the other, Margaret looked exactly as Annie remembered. Silver hair cut neatly at the jaw, black framed glasses, dark dress, measuring tape looped around her neck as if she had forgotten it was there. She did not wave too brightly or rush forward. She simply smiled and waited. "Annie Brooks," Margaret said when Annie reached her. "Thank you for coming." "Yes, ma'am. Margaret is fine. Sit wherever you feel comfortable." That sentence almost made Annie leave. People said things like that when every chair in the room still belonged to them. But Margaret sat first, not behind a desk, not across a table like an interview, but beside a small round coffee table near the window. Annie chose the chair with its back to the wall. Margaret noticed and said nothing. "Would you like coffee? Tea? Water?" "No, thank you." "All right." Margaret set her cup down. "I asked you here because I remember what I saw last year. Not because of what happened at the wedding." Annie kept her hands folded over the sketchbook. "Everybody keeps saying that. Then we should all keep proving it." Annie looked up. Margaret leaned back. "May I see your drawings?" For a moment, Annie's fingers did not move. Showing sketches felt more intimate than explaining poverty. Poverty was visible. People made assumptions about it before she opened her mouth. But drawings showed what she still wanted, and wanting something was dangerous when life had already taken so much. She slid the sketchbook across the table. Margaret opened it carefully, the way Mrs. Clara handled old fabric. She did not flip fast. She looked. A dress with soft sleeves. A reception arch made from bare winter branches and white roses. Table settings in cream and blue. A sketch of a church basement turned into a wedding hall with cheap lights hung low to hide the ceiling pipes. A child's flower girl dress drawn beside notes about using leftover lace. "These are not nothing," Margaret said. Annie's shoulders tightened. "They're rough." "Of course they're rough. You're 18, tired, and drawing between shifts. Rough is not the same as empty." Margaret turned another page. "You understand movement. You leave space for people to breathe. That matters in event design. Most beginners crowd a room because they think beauty means filling every corner." Annie swallowed. No one had talked about her work like it was real in more than a year. "My grandmother used to say a dress had to let a woman live in it," she said before she could stop herself. Margaret smiled. "Your grandmother was right." Annie looked down. She sewed for people, mostly alterations, church dresses, prom dresses, funeral suits. She could fix anything. "Did she teach you?" "She tried. I got impatient with hems. I liked drawing more. Many designers do, until a seamstress saves them from embarrassment." That pulled a small laugh from Annie. Margaret turned to the page with pale blue stitching along the hem of the wedding dress. The note at the bottom was still there. "For Grandma, when I make it back." She did not read it aloud. Annie was grateful. "Mr. Whitaker asked whether there is a place for you in the event design department," Margaret said. "I told him there could be, if it is done correctly." Annie's face guarded itself at once. "What does that mean?" "It means paid work, not a favor, a training role with clear duties. You would assist with fabric inventory, color boards, vendor prep, room layouts, setup notes, and eventually client mock-ups. You would still do some physical work. Design is not all flowers and applause. It is ladders, pins, tape, last-minute stains, and brides who change their minds after approving everything." That sounds familiar. It should. You have seen the hard part from the service side. That gives you an advantage, if you learn to use it. Annie looked toward the lobby. A couple checked in at the front desk, laughing about a missing suitcase. Their lives sounded far away. "And school?" she asked. "Denise told me you might want to go back." "I never said that." "No, but your sketchbook did." Annie's throat tightened. "School costs money." "Yes." "And time." "Yes. And I can't live on encouragement. No one should have to." Margaret folded her hands. "The proposal is part-time paid apprenticeship with a set schedule, enough notice to enroll in evening classes, and tuition assistance if you remain in good standing. There would also be a mentor review every month." Annie stared at her. "Why would he do that? Charles?" "Yes." Margaret took a breath. "Because he should have done something like it before. Because his wife wanted programs that treated people as more than labor. Because last night made him look at things he had stopped looking at. Those may be his reasons. They do not have to be yours." Annie pressed her palm flat against the sketchbook. I don't want to be some story they tell at donor dinners. Then don't be. That's not always up to me. No, Margaret said, it isn't, which is why you ask for terms, in writing. Annie blinked. Terms? Yes. Hours, pay, duties, school schedule, who supervises you, what happens if someone mistreats you, what happens if the press asks questions, what you do and do not consent to share about your life. Margaret tapped the sketchbook once. Talent needs protection as much as opportunity. Annie sat back. No one had ever said that to her. People told her to be grateful, careful, realistic, patient. They told her to work hard, as if she had not been doing that since she was old enough to stand on a chair and rinse dishes beside Grandma Rose. But protection was a different word. It suggested her dream was not foolish just because it was fragile. Can I think about it? She asked. I hoped you would. That answer steadied her more than pressure would have. Margaret took a card from her folder. This is my direct number. Not the front desk. Not Victor. Not anyone else. If you decide to talk further, call me. If you decide no, call me anyway so I don't worry. Annie took the card. You worry about people you barely know? I'm 64. It comes with the knees. This time Annie did smile. As she stood, Margaret closed the sketchbook and handed it back with both hands. One more thing. Annie waited. You are not behind because you left school. You are carrying more than most students had to carry. That is not the same thing. Annie nodded, but she could not speak. She walked through the lobby with the sketchbook pressed to her chest, past the fireplace, past the winter flowers, past the doorman with the silver eyebrows. Have a good day, miss, he said. She stopped just outside, where the cold met her face. For the first time in a long while, the word miss did not sound like politeness meant for someone else. It sounded like a place she might be allowed to stand. Across town, Charles read Margaret's message in his office. She has talent. She is cautious. Good. Do not rush her. He looked at those last 4 words for a long time. Do not rush her. Eleanor would have said the same. She had always known that help could become another form of control when the helper needed gratitude too quickly. Charles set the phone down and turned back to the draft policy on his desk. The title at the top read, Food Recovery and Community Distribution Initiative. Elaine had too corporate. Feed people, Charles. He almost heard Eleanor laugh. Martin stepped in. Reverend Green confirmed a pilot pickup after Saturday's conference dinner. Good. Denise also sent the update on Mr. Samuel. The outreach nurse saw him this morning. Bronchitis, likely. They got him antibiotics. Charles nodded. Mrs. Clara? Scheduled at the clinic tomorrow. Old Ben stayed one night, left before breakfast, then came back for coffee. Charles allowed himself a small smile. That sounds like old Ben. Martin glanced at him. You haven't met him, sir. No, Charles said, looking out over the city. Not yet. That evening, Annie returned to her rented room and laid the 2 business cards side by side on the table. Denise Carter and Margaret Ellis. Then she opened her sketchbook to the dress with blue stitching. For a long time, she did not draw. She only touched the page where she had written for Grandma, when I make it back. Then she picked up a pencil and added one small thing she had not known the dress needed. A pocket hidden inside the skirt. Grandma Rose had always said every woman needed a place to keep something of her own. On Saturday morning, Annie sat at the small table in her rented room with Margaret's card on one side, Denise's card on the other, and her grandmother's sewing tin between them like a judge. The tin was blue, scratched at the corners, and still smelled faintly of thread, peppermint, and the lavender soap Grandma Rose used to keep in the dresser. Inside were needles, buttons sorted by color, safety pins, a thimble with a dent in the side, and a folded $5 bill Grandma had once called emergency money. Annie had never spent it. Some things were worth more when they stayed where love had left them. She had been awake since 6, though her meeting with Charles Whitaker was not until 11. Denise had called the night before and explained it twice. You are not being summoned, Denise had said. You are being invited. Margaret will be there. I will be there. Elaine from legal will be there to put things in writing if you choose to move forward. You can say no. And if I say no, then you say no. That simple? No, but it should be. Annie had almost asked if Charles would be angry, then hated herself for thinking like that. Victor had trained the whole room to fear one man's mood. She did not want to carry that fear into another room. At 10:30, she put on her cleanest blouse, a navy cardigan, and black pants she had pressed under a stack of books because she did not own an iron. She tied her hair back, then let it down, then tied it back again. In the mirror above the sink, she saw an 18-year-old trying to look like someone ready for an office conversation when part of her still felt like the girl standing in the hall with bread on the table and shame burning behind her eyes. She touched the sewing tin before she left. "Don't let me be foolish," she whispered, though she was not sure whether she was speaking to God, Grandma Rose, or herself. The meeting took place in a conference room at the Midtown property, not the restaurant where Victor had cornered her. Annie appreciated that more than she expected. The room had a round table instead of a long one. Coffee sat on a sideboard. So did water, fruit, and a plate of biscuits no one mentioned too quickly. Charles stood when she entered. So did Margaret, Denise, and Elaine Porter. "Miss Brooks," Charles said. "Mr. Whitaker." He gestured to a chair, but he did not tell her where to sit. Annie chose the seat between Denise and Margaret. Elaine opened a folder. "Before we talk about work, I want to say this clearly. What happened the other night is under review. You are not required to sign anything about that incident today. This meeting is about a possible role, not about silencing you." Annie looked at Charles. "Did you ask her to say that?" "No," Charles said. "She said it because she is better at this than I am." Elaine glanced at him. "That is also going in my notes." Margaret hid a smile behind her coffee. Denise leaned slightly toward Annie. "You can stop us any time." Annie nodded, though her hands were tight in her lap. Charles placed a thin packet on the table, not sliding it toward her yet. "I owe you an apology first." Annie looked up. "I stood in that hall longer than I should have before speaking." The room went quiet. Charles continued. "I told myself I needed to understand the situation. Some of that was true. Some of it was habit. Men like me get used to observing discomfort before deciding whether it is our business. That is not something I am proud of." Annie did not know what answer was expected, so she gave the only honest one. "You did speak. Late," he said, "but yes." She studied him. He did not look like he wanted forgiveness handed to him in front of witnesses. That made it easier not to give it too fast. Margaret touched the packet. "This is the apprenticeship proposal. Paid position, 28 hours a week to start. Event Design Assistant Apprentice. You would report to me, not to banquet floor management. Duties include inventory, setup boards, fabric handling, mock table layouts, vendor prep, and design documentation. No one can pull you into dish room or cleanup unless you agree in writing and are paid under the correct role." Annie blinked. 28 hours? With a fixed schedule, Denise said. "So you can attend evening classes." Elaine added, "Tuition assistance begins after 90 days, but Mr. Whitaker has approved an advance education grant for enrollment fees if you choose to return sooner. It does not require you to share your personal story publicly. It does require attendance and passing grades." "That part was Margaret," Charles said. Margaret nodded. "I am not mentoring someone who thinks talent excuses missed work." Annie almost smiled. "I don't miss work." "I know." Elaine turned a page. "Pay rate is here. Benefits eligibility begins if the role expands to full-time. Transportation stipend included. You can take the document with you. You do not have to sign today." Annie looked at the number and forgot to breathe for a second. It was not rich money. It was not miracle money. But it was steady money, with hours she could plan around. It was enough to imagine buying groceries before counting coins. Enough to think about school forms without feeling sick. "What's the catch?" she asked. Charles answered, "There should not be one." "That's not an answer." "No," he said. "It's an intention. Elaine will make it an answer." Elaine tapped the packet. "The catch is work. Real work. You show up. You learn. You accept correction. You do not get special treatment in standards. Only protection from mistreatment." Annie looked at Margaret. Margaret met her eyes. "You will make mistakes. I will tell you. You may not enjoy how I tell you." "That sounds normal." "It is. Normal is the point." The word normal sat in Annie's chest with a weight she had not expected. She had not wanted a rescue. She had wanted a life where she could be corrected without being crushed, tired without being trapped, helped without being owned. Charles reached into his coat and took out something folded in a clear sleeve. He placed it on the table. Annie recognized it before anyone explained. A piece of the brown paper bag from the wedding hall. The torn edge was still rough. "I kept this," Charles said. "Not as evidence against you, as evidence against us." Annie stared at it. "My wife used to say companies remember profit better than people." She was right more often than I admitted. "This program we are building should have existed years ago." "The food program?" Annie asked. "Yes. We are calling it the Eleanor Table Program, if the board approves the name. Safe leftovers from events will go to certified community partners. Street Marks is the first. More will follow." Annie's voice softened despite herself. "Named after your wife?" Charles nodded. "She would have fed the people at that bus stop before asking who approved it." For the first time, Annie saw the grief in him without the cover of wealth. It did not make them equal. Nothing about that room made them equal. But it made him human. Denise slid a pen toward Annie, then stopped herself. "Only if you're ready." Annie looked at the packet again. Her grandmother's voice came back. Not loud, not dramatic, just plain as a hand on her shoulder. "A door ain't the same as a home, baby. But you can't get home if you never walk through one." Annie picked up the pen, then set it down. "I want one thing added." Elaine sat straighter. "Tell me, if anyone asks why I got this job, I don't want people saying it's because I was hungry or because I cried in front of a rich man. I want it written that I'm here to train and design, and if I'm not good enough, you tell me straight." Margaret's face changed first. Not pity, approval. Elaine wrote quickly. "We can add performance-based training language and privacy protections." Charles said, "Done." Annie looked at him. "And the people at the bus stop?" Denise answered. "Mr. Samuel has a clinic appointment Monday. Mrs. Clara met with the outreach team this morning. Old Ben is pretending he dislikes everyone but accepted socks." Annie let out a breath that almost became a laugh. Charles leaned forward slightly. "Your kindness to them is not a condition of this offer, Annie. You do not have to keep proving you are good to deserve opportunity." She looked down at the packet. "I don't know how to stop proving things." "No," he said quietly. "I don't suppose you do." This time, when Annie picked up the pen, her hand still trembled, but not from fear alone. She signed her name slowly. Annie Brooks. The letters looked small on the page, but they were hers. Margaret closed the folder after Elaine made a copy. "You start Monday at 9. Wear comfortable shoes. Bring your sketchbook. Leave your pride at home only when it gets in the way of learning. Bring it when someone tries to make you small." Annie nodded. "Yes, ma'am. And call me Margaret." "I'll try. That is not a promise, but it is a beginning." When the meeting ended, Annie walked out carrying a copy of the agreement in a clean folder. No one applauded. No one hugged her without asking. No one told her she had been saved. That was what made it feel real. In the lobby, she paused near the fireplace and opened the folder just enough to see her name printed beneath the title, Event Design Assistant Apprentice. For a moment, the girl who had scrubbed floors after midnight and the girl who had once drawn dresses in the margins of class notes stood in the same body without fighting each other. Outside, the winter air was still cold. The rent was still due next week. School was not solved yet. Grief had not packed its bags and left her room, but Annie held the folder against her chest and stepped through the glass doors anyway. This time, she did not leave by the back. Monday morning came with hard rain. Annie reached the Midtown property at 8:34, far too early for a 9 o'clock start, but she could not make herself wait at home. Her folder was inside her bag, sealed in a plastic grocery sack, so the rain would not touch it. Her sketchbook was wrapped the same way. She wore the black pants from the meeting, a clean white shirt, and the most comfortable shoes she owned, though one sole still clicked faintly when she walked. At the front entrance, the doorman with silver eyebrows opened the door. "Morning, Miss Brooks." She stopped for half a second. "You know my name?" "Yes, ma'am. Miss Ellis said to expect you." Annie nodded, unsure why that made her throat tighten. For most of her working life, people knew her only by uniform color, shift time, or the clipboard name they mispronounced. Miss Brooks sounded formal, almost too large for her. Still, she stepped inside. Margaret Ellis was waiting near the event design office with a roll of fabric under one arm and reading glasses on top of her head. "You're early," Margaret said. "I didn't want to be late. There are numbers between early and late." "I'm learning." Margaret gave a small, approving hum. "Good answer. Come on." The design office sat behind the ballroom level. Not hidden like the service corridors, but not placed for guests either. It smelled of paper, coffee, ribbon, and flowers stored too long in buckets. One wall held shelves of fabric samples arranged by color. Another had photographs of past weddings and corporate dinners pinned beside floor plans. A large table in the center carried tape measures, scissors, paint chips, mock invitations, and 3 half-finished centerpiece samples. Annie stood just inside the door. Margaret noticed. "This room is not a museum. Touch things when you need to. Put them back where you found them. If you don't know where they go, ask." "Yes, ma'am." "Margaret." "Yes, ma'am." Margaret sighed. "We will lose that battle slowly." She introduced Annie to the team. Luis, who handled lighting plots and could make a plain hotel wall look expensive with 6 lamps and a ladder. Priya, who managed floral vendors and spoke to roses as if they were stubborn relatives. And June, a seamstress in her late 50s who had worked in theater before deciding brides were less dramatic than actors, though only by a little. No one clapped. No one gave her a pity smile. Luis handed her a stack of linen swatches and said, "Sort these by shade, not label. Labels lie." Priya pointed to 3 buckets of white flowers and said, "Tell me which one reads warm under yellow light." June looked at Annie's cardigan sleeve and said, "Your cuff repair is neat. Too tight, but neat." Annie blinked. "Thank you?" It was half a compliment. Take it. For the first hour, Annie did small tasks. She sorted linen swatches, labeled ribbon spools, and watched Margaret compare 2 shades of ivory that looked identical until Margaret placed them beside a gold charger and asked, "Which one makes the plate look cheap?" Annie chose the one on the left. Margaret nodded. "Why?" "It's too blue. The gold turns green beside it." Luis looked over from the lighting table. "She sees it." Margaret did not praise too much. "Good. Write that down." Annie did. By noon, her feet hurt, but not in the old way. This was not the ache of being invisible. It was the ache of standing in a room where her eyes were being used. During lunch, Annie sat alone at first in the employee dining room with a turkey sandwich she had brought from home. She had packed it because she did not know whether she was allowed to eat staff meals. Denise found her before the question could become another worry. "You know lunch is included on training days," Denise said, setting down a tray across from her. "I wasn't sure. Now you are." Annie looked at the line where employees served themselves soup, salad, coffee, and fruit. "Does everyone know about what happened?" Denise did not pretend. "Some know pieces." "People always know pieces." "What pieces?" "That Victor was suspended. That Mr. Whitaker is reviewing food waste. That you're starting in design." Annie unwrapped her sandwich slowly. "So, they think I got him suspended. Victor got Victor suspended. That won't stop people from saying it." "No, but saying is not the same as truth." Annie looked toward a nearby table where 2 banquet servers had lowered their voices. One glanced at her, then away. Denise followed Annie's gaze. "You do your work. Let the rest pass through. My grandmother used to say that. Smart woman." She was. Denise opened her soup. The first pickup for the Eleanor Table program went out Saturday night. Annie's attention shifted. It worked? Rough around the edges, driver was late, labels were ugly. Reverend Green complained about the containers. "That sounds like him." "You met him?" "No, but old churchmen complain a certain way." Denise smiled. "Fair. Still, 46 meals went out. Mr. Samuel got soup. Mrs. Clara asked whether the rolls came from a wedding. Annie looked down, smiling despite herself. She would. Old Ben took 2 pairs of socks and told the volunteer not to make a speech about it. That is definitely him. The warmth in her chest lasted until she returned to the design office and found a woman waiting near Margaret's desk. She was young, maybe 26, dressed in a fitted black blazer with a tablet pressed against her side. Her hair was sleek, her smile quick and polished. Margaret introduced her as Tessa Monroe, junior event coordinator. Tessa looked Annie over in one smooth glance. Oh, you're the new apprentice. Yes, I heard about you. Margaret's head lifted slightly from the floor plan she was marking. Annie kept her voice even. I'm here to learn. Of course, Tessa said. We're all learning something. It was not openly cruel. That was the skill of it. Annie had been around enough people like Tessa to know how insult could hide inside manners. Margaret placed her pencil down. Tessa, do you have the revised seating chart for the Hollister rehearsal dinner? Yes. Tessa handed over the tablet, then looked at Annie again. We need someone to steam chair sashes later. Is that design enough? The room quieted. Annie felt heat rise in her face. But before Margaret could answer, she said, if the sashes are part of the room, then yes. Louise made a small sound that might have been a cough. Tessa's smile thinned. Good attitude. Margaret looked at Annie, then at Tessa. Steam them with her. You approved the fabric folded wrong. Tessa's face changed. I have client calls. Move one. Yes, Margaret. After Tessa left, Annie stared at the ribbon drawer as if it contained instructions for surviving the day. Margaret returned to the floor plan. You handled that well. I wanted to say something else. I assumed. Would that have been wrong? Depends what you said. Annie thought about it. Then probably. Margaret allowed herself half a smile. Good judgment is often the insult you swallow and turn into better work. By 4, Annie was helping June in the fabric room. They measured pale blue runners for a winter wedding and cut them to length. June watched Annie pin a corner and corrected her hand position. You pull like you're afraid the cloth will run away. I'm used to things moving when I need them to stay. June paused, then handed her another pin. Cloth listens if you guide it, not if you fight it. Annie tried again. This time the edge lay flat. At 5:30, Margaret reviewed Annie's notes. There were too many of them, written in careful print. Ivory versus cream. Warm white roses. Check linen under actual light. Labels lie. Flowers bruise if crowded. Client memory matters more than centerpiece height. Margaret read the last line twice. Where did you get that? Annie hesitated. Watching weddings. People don't remember every flower. They remember if the room felt like them. Margaret looked at her for a long moment. That is the first thing you've said today that belongs in a design meeting. Annie did not know whether to smile. Write it on a clean card, Margaret said. Pin it above your station. My station? Margaret pointed to a small desk near the fabric shelves. It held an empty tray, a cup of pencils, and a name tag still in plastic. Annie Brooks. Event Design Apprentice. Annie touched the edge of the name tag, not picking it up yet. The day had not been easy. Tessa's words still stung. Her feet hurt. She had made 3 mistakes, asked 14 questions, and nearly cried once in the supply closet when she saw a bolt of blue fabric the same shade as the dress Grandma Rose wore to church on Easter. But there was a desk with her name on it. Not a folding chair in a hallway. Not a mop closet shelf. Not a time card someone could lose. A desk. Margaret softened her voice. Do not make it holy. It is just a place to work. Annie nodded, though to her it was not just that. When she left after 6, rain had stopped. The city smelled like wet pavement and exhaust. Annie carried leftover notes in her bag. Along with a staff meal container Denise had insisted she take, because included means included. At the bus stop, she opened her sketchbook and wrote one sentence under the hidden pocket dress. A room can change depending on who is allowed to stand in it. Then she closed the book before the thought became too tender to carry and watched for the bus that would take her home. The next morning, Annie found her name tag clipped to the edge of her station. She stood there a moment longer than she meant to. The office was quiet except for the low hum of the printer and the sound of Louise arguing softly with a lighting vendor over the phone. On the desk, someone had left a clean notebook, 3 pencils, a ruler, a roll of pale masking tape, and a small stack of index cards. Margaret walked past with a cup of coffee and did not slow down. If you stare at it any longer, it will start charging rent. Annie picked up the name tag and fastened it to her cardigan. Good morning. It will be if the Hollister rehearsal dinner stops changing table counts. Do they always change things this much? Only when they have relatives. Annie almost smiled and opened the notebook. On the first page, she wrote the date. Then the phrase from yesterday. A room can change depending on who is allowed to stand in it. She had not planned to write it again, but it settled her. At 9:30, Margaret called her over to the center table. "Today you shadow me in the ballroom. We're preparing a mock layout for Friday's event. You observe first. Then you help. Ask questions after I finish talking to the client, not while the client is deciding whether the napkins have betrayed her." "Yes, ma'am." "Margaret." "Yes, Margaret." Progress. They walked into Ballroom C, where staff had set up 3 sample tables. Each one carried a different version of the same winter theme. One with silver chargers and white roses. One with cream linens and candlelight. One with pale blue runners and low greenery. Annie saw the blue first. She tried not to let her eyes stay there too long. Tessa Monroe stood beside the first table with a tablet in hand. She looked at Annie's name tag, then at Margaret. "I didn't realize apprentices were client-facing so soon." "She is not client-facing," Margaret said. "She is learning-facing." Tessa smiled. "Of course." The client arrived 10 minutes late. A woman named Mrs. Hollister with a camel coat, pearl earrings, and the distracted expression of someone planning a dinner for 40 relatives who all thought they were helping. She greeted Margaret warmly, nodded to Tessa, and glanced at Annie without placing her. Margaret handled the presentation with patience. She explained candle height, guest sight lines, linen texture, and how the pale blue softened the room without making it look like a baby shower. Mrs. Hollister listened, frowned, changed her mind twice, then returned to the second table. "I like the cream," she said, "but it feels a little safe." Tessa tapped her tablet. "We can add height with crystal branches." Margaret's eyebrow moved. "We can." "We should not." Mrs. Hollister turned toward Annie suddenly. "You're young. What do you think?" Annie froze. Tessa answered before she could. "She's observing today." Mrs. Hollister kept looking at Annie. "Observing people often notice what the rest of us talk over." Margaret did not rescue her. "Answer if you have an answer." Annie looked at the 3 tables, her pulse beat in her throat. "The cream is right," she said, "but the candles are too white. They make the table look cold. If you keep the cream linen and use warmer candles, maybe add the blue only in small places, like the menu ribbon or the inside fold of the napkin, it would feel less safe without changing the whole room." Mrs. Hollister studied the table again. "The inside fold of the napkin?" "Yes, ma'am. Most guests won't notice it at first. But when they sit down, they'll see it. It makes the place setting feel more personal." Margaret's face gave away nothing. Tessa's did. Mrs. Hollister nodded slowly. "I like that. It feels like a secret." Annie looked down before her relief showed too much. Margaret turned to Tessa. "Update the mock-up. Warm ivory candles, cream linen, pale blue ribbon tucked into the napkin fold. No crystal branches." Tessa's smile was tight. "Of course." When Mrs. Hollister left, Margaret began gathering the sample cards. "You spoke when asked. You explained your reason. You did not apologize for having an opinion." "Good." Annie let out the breath she had been holding. "I thought I was going to faint." "You didn't. That is also useful." Tessa closed her tablet with more force than necessary. It was a lucky suggestion. Margaret did not look up. Most good taste sounds like luck to people who don't have it. Luis, who had entered to check a dimmer switch, turned around and walked right back out. Tessa's face flushed. "I have vendor calls." "Take them," Margaret said. After she left, Annie touched the edge of a napkin. "I didn't mean to make trouble." "You did not make trouble. You answered a question. Learn the difference, or people will use your politeness to keep you quiet." That stayed with Annie the rest of the morning. At lunch, she did not sit alone. June waved her over to a table with Priya and Louis. Annie hesitated only once before joining them. Louis was eating chili from a plastic container and marking lighting notes between bites. Priya had a salad, a bag of chips, and 3 flour invoices spread out like evidence. "Heard you saved us from crystal branches," Louis said. "I didn't know they were that bad." "They are not always bad," Priya said. "Only in the hands of people who think expensive means appropriate." June pointed her fork at Annie. "Remember that. Expensive can still be ugly." Annie nodded. "I've seen that." Nobody asked her to explain. Across town, Charles sat with Reverend Green, Elaine, Denise, and 2 operations managers, who looked increasingly uncomfortable as the meeting went on. The first pilot pickup had gone well enough to prove the idea was possible and rough enough to expose every excuse the company would use to avoid expanding it. Reverend Green had brought a notebook filled with handwritten details, containers stacked poorly, labels too small. Driver didn't know which door to use. Half the food was fine, but the kitchen held it too long before release. One operations manager cleared his throat. "We are dealing with banquet schedules. Staff are already stretched." Denise looked at him. "Staff were stretched before. They still managed to throw food away." Elaine added, "The legal barrier is manageable. The operational barrier is discipline. That is our problem." Charles looked at the managers. "Then solve it." The younger manager, Paulson, shifted in his chair. "Sir, some clients may not like knowing their wedding leftovers are being redistributed. It could make the event feel less exclusive." Reverend Green leaned back. "Feeding people does have a way of ruining selfishness." Elaine coughed into her hand. Charles did not smile. "If a client objects to safe leftover food going to people who need it, we may not be the venue for that client." Paulson looked startled. "That could cost us." "Yes, substantially." Charles folded his hands. "I have spent years paying for centerpieces no one remembers. I can afford decency." The room went quiet. After the meeting, Denise stayed behind. "Annie made her first client suggestion today." Charles looked up. "How did she do?" Margaret said, and I quote, "She did not embarrass herself, which is more than I can say for most executives." That sounds like praise. From Margaret, it's a standing ovation. Charles nodded, but Denise did not leave. "What is it?" he asked. "Victor's lawyer is pushing. They want to frame this as emotional overreaction because of your wife." Charles's expression changed only slightly. "They mentioned Eleanor?" "Not directly yet. They will if they think it helps." For a moment, Charles looked toward the photograph on his shelf. Eleanor in a blue dress, laughing at something outside the frame. He felt the old anger rise, but beneath it came something colder and more useful. "Then we keep the review factual," he said. "Waste records, payroll threats, employee statements, video, written comments, no speeches." Denise nodded. "Good. And Denise?" "Yes? If anyone in this company uses my wife's death to excuse cruelty, they will learn the difference between grief and weakness." Denise held his gaze, then gave a small nod. "Understood." That evening, Annie stayed 15 minutes after her shift to pin the revised napkin fold sample onto her station board. Cream linen, warm candle note, pale blue ribbon hidden inside. Margaret passed behind her. "You're allowed to go home." "I know. Do you?" Annie smiled faintly. "I'm practicing." Margaret looked at the sample. "Good work today." This time Annie did not deflect it. "Thank you." On the bus home, she opened her sketchbook and drew a small table setting with a ribbon tucked where only the guest would find it. Underneath, she wrote, "Not everything beautiful has to announce itself." At the next stop, an older woman climbed aboard with grocery bags in both hands. Annie stood and offered her seat. The woman nodded gratefully. "Bless you, baby." Annie held the overhead rail as the bus pulled away. Outside, the city passed in dark windows and wet streets. For the first time in months, she was tired from building something instead of surviving something. And though the difference was small, she could feel it all the way home. The next 2 days taught Annie that a new room did not erase an old wound. It only gave her a different place to stand while it healed. By Wednesday morning, the story had traveled farther through the company than anyone admitted. No one said it to her directly. They said it around her. A whisper near the copier. A pause when she entered the employee dining room. A banquet captain from another floor looking at her name tag and then looking twice. Most people were not cruel. Some were curious. A few were careful in a way that made Annie feel less like a person and more like a glass someone feared dropping. Tessa was not careful. She arrived in the design office carrying a box of sample candles and placed it on the central table harder than necessary. "Big day," she said. Margaret did not look up from her floor plan. "For whom?" "For the program." Tessa's smile had no warmth. "I hear Mr. Whitaker is making it official. Press release, church partners, all that. Amazing what one bag of leftovers can do." Annie kept her eyes on the ribbon inventory. Cream satin, ivory grosgrain, pale blue silk. silver velvet. Luis, working near the lighting shelf, said, "Amazing what 6 months of waste records can do." Tessa glanced at him. "I didn't say anything wrong." "No," Margaret said. "You rarely make that mistake clearly." Tessa's face tightened. "I just think some people are getting very fast opportunities while the rest of us had to work our way up." Annie set down the ribbon card. Margaret finally looked at Tessa. "You are welcome to compare portfolios with her." Tessa laughed once. "She has a portfolio?" Annie felt the old heat rise in her face. This time, she did not lower her head. "It's small," she said, "but it's mine." The room went still. Tessa looked surprised, not because the words were sharp, but because Annie had said them at all. Margaret capped her pen. "Tessa, the hotel needs the corrected vendor list for Saturday. If you have time to measure other people's opportunities, you have time to do your job." Tessa picked up her tablet and left without answering. Luis waited until the door closed. "For what it's worth, my first portfolio was 3 lighting diagrams and a photograph of a lamp I thought looked emotional." Priya looked up from a flower order. "Lamps can be emotional." "No, this one was ugly." June, threading a needle near the window, said, "Most beginnings are." Annie returned to the ribbons, but her hands had steadied. A week ago, Tessa's comment would have followed her for hours. Today it still hurt, but it did not own the room. Near noon, Denise came to the design office. Her face told Margaret enough before she spoke. "Annie, do you have a few minutes?" Annie put down her pencil. "Did something happen?" "Not to you. But we need to ask whether you are willing to attend a short internal review this afternoon. Victor's attorney will be present by phone. Elaine will lead it. You do not have to answer anything you don't want to answer." Annie's stomach tightened. "Is he going to be there? Victor?" "No. Not in the room. That doesn't mean he won't be in it." Denise nodded. "No, it doesn't." Margaret stepped closer. "I can come if you want." Annie almost said no out of habit. Then she remembered what Margaret had said about talent needing protection. "Yes," Annie said. "Please." At 2:00, Annie sat in a conference room beside Margaret, with Denise across from her and Elaine at the head of the table. Charles was there too, though he sat away from the center, as if making clear this was not a performance for him. A speakerphone rested in the middle of the table. Victor's attorney introduced himself in a smooth voice that made every sentence sound polished before it had meaning. "Miss Brooks," he said, "we appreciate your time. This is simply to clarify the events of that evening." Elaine looked at Annie. "You may answer only if you choose." Annie nodded. The attorney began gently. Had Annie been informed of the policy? Did she understand that food from private events was not to be removed? Had she placed food in a bag without asking a supervisor? Had Mr. Harlan used physical force? Had he actually called the police? Had anyone prevented her from leaving? Each question was built like a narrow hallway. Annie answered slowly. "I knew we weren't supposed to take food. I also knew it was going to be thrown out. He took the bag from me. He made me open it in front of people. He said I wouldn't be paid. He said I wouldn't work events in the city again." The attorney replied, "But he did not strike you." Annie looked at the speakerphone. "No, and he did not use a racial slur." Margaret's hand moved slightly under the table, but she did not speak. Annie felt the room waiting. "No," she said, "he didn't need to." The line went quiet. The attorney cleared his throat. "Could you explain what you mean by that?" Annie looked once at Denise, then at Elaine, then at Charles. "No one pushed her. No one rescued her," she said. "When a man points at a black girl in a uniform and calls her a thief before he asks why she has bread in a bag, he doesn't have to use the worst word for everyone to understand where he placed her. When he says girls like you, he knows what he means." "So do I." Elaine wrote something down. The attorney's tone changed. "Miss Brooks, is it possible you interpreted a stressful managerial response through the lens of your own personal experiences?" Annie almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Yes," she said, "that is how people survive. We remember what happened before so we can recognize it when it comes back wearing a different tie." Charles looked down at the table. Margaret's eyes stayed on Annie, steady and proud. The attorney tried again. "You understand Mr. Harlan maintains he was enforcing policy." Elaine interrupted. "Policy enforcement is not under dispute. Conduct during enforcement is." "Miss Porter, you have asked your clarification questions. Unless you have something relevant, we are done with Miss Brooks. There was a pause. No further questions. Elaine ended the call. For a moment, Annie sat perfectly still. Then she realized her hands were shaking under the table. Denise pushed a glass of water toward her. You did well, Margaret said. Annie took the glass. I hated every second of that. Both can be true, Denise said. Charles spoke for the first time. I'm sorry you had to explain what should have been obvious. Annie looked at him. It isn't obvious to people who benefit from not seeing it. The words came out before she could make them softer. Charles accepted them without flinching. You're right. Elaine closed her folder. The review is nearly complete. Victor's written comments, the video, employee statements, and his record of wage threats establish enough for termination with cause. There may also be wage and discrimination exposure if we find a wider pattern. Denise said, We already found a wider pattern. Elaine nodded. Then we document it properly. Annie stared at the table. Termination, cause, exposure, pattern. These were office words, clean words. But behind them were people like her, people who had gone home with smaller checks, fewer shifts, names marked quietly as difficult. What happens to him? She asked. Charles answered, He will not return to floor management. That's not what I asked, Elaine said. He is being terminated. If legal review supports further action, we pursue it. If employees are owed wages, they will be paid. Annie nodded. She expected to feel relief. Instead, she felt tired. Margaret seemed to understand. Justice does not always feel like comfort. No, Annie said. It feels like remembering. Later that afternoon, the official notice went out to managers. Victor Harlan's employment had been terminated following an internal investigation into misconduct, discriminatory behavior, wage retaliation, and violation of employee dignity standards. The words were formal. They did not mention Annie by name. Denise had made sure of that. Still, everyone knew something had shifted. In the employee dining room, a dishwasher named Maribel touched Annie's elbow gently as she passed. He cut my hours last summer because I asked to take leftovers home after a funeral lunch, Maribel said. I got 2 kids. He told me to learn budgeting. Annie did not know what to say. Maribel continued. I'm glad he's gone. I didn't do it alone. No, Maribel said. But you didn't disappear. That sentence stayed with Annie through the rest of the day. At 5:30, Charles stood in the empty wedding hall where it had started. The tables were gone now. The floor had been polished. No bread. No apples. No torn paper bag. Just space. Denise found him there. Press release for the Eleanor Table program is ready for tomorrow, she said. Remove my quote. It needs one. Use Reverend Green. He already has one. Use Annie's? She did not consent to that. Then no quote. Denise studied him. You are learning. Slowly, she handed him a folder. Final termination packet. Back wage review begins Monday. Elaine also found Eleanor's old proposal in archives. Charles took the folder but did not open it. What did she call it? He asked. Denise looked at the page. The shared table project. Charles closed his eyes briefly. Of course she had. When he opened them, he looked around the hall again. Name the first internal training after her proposal. Not after me. Denise nodded. And the food program? The Eleanor Table program stays. That evening, Annie returned home with Margaret's notes, her staff meal, and a tiredness that sat deep in her bones. She placed her sketchbook on the table but did not open it right away. Instead, she took out Grandma Rose's sewing tin and removed the dented thimble. She held it in her palm for a long time. You always said don't let people make me small, she whispered. The room was quiet, but not empty in the way it had been before. Annie opened her sketchbook to a clean page. She drew a long table, simple and strong, with chairs on both sides. At first, she drew only 4 chairs. Then she added more. 1 for Mr. Samuel. 1 for Mrs. Clara. 1 for Old Ben. 1 for Grandma Rose. 1 for Eleanor, though Annie had never met her. At the end, she drew a chair with her own initials on the back. Under the sketch, she wrote, Justice is not revenge. It is making room for the people who were pushed out. Then she closed the book and sat very still, listening to the radiator knock in the wall, feeling for the first time that the sound was not just noise in a poor room, but a reminder that something old could still carry heat. The announcement went out the next morning at 10, though Charles refused to let the company dress it up like a celebration. There were no balloons, no ribbon across the ballroom doors, no photographer asking people to stand closer together. The room was the same wedding hall where Annie had been forced to open a paper bag in front of strangers. Now the tables had been arranged in a wide semicircle. At the front stood a simple wooden table with a framed photograph of Eleanor Whitaker, a basket of bread, and a stack of white food-safe containers labeled with dates, times, and pickup locations. Annie stood near the back beside Margaret. She had asked not to be placed at the front, and for once, everyone had listened. Her name was not in the press release. Her story was not printed in bold letters. She was there because Denise had said, "You deserve to see what came from the truth you told, but you do not owe anyone your face." That was the reason Annie came. Reverend Paul Green stood near the front in a dark cardigan and clerical collar, speaking quietly with Elaine Porter. He looked around the hall the way older men looked at rooms that had too much money in the ceiling and not enough mercy in the walls. Charles approached the microphone, then stepped back before touching it. He looked at Denise. "No speech," she reminded him. "I know. You always know right before you almost do one." He gave her a brief look, then faced the room. "Thank you for coming," Charles said. "Today we begin the Eleanor Table program. From this week forward, safe, untouched food from events at participating Whitaker hospitality properties will be packaged, labeled, and delivered to approved community partners. Street, Mark's Community Kitchen is our first partner. Others will follow as fast as we can train the staff and build the routes correctly." He paused. His eyes moved over the employees, department heads, kitchen staff, drivers, volunteers, and a handful of local reporters standing near the side wall. This should have happened years ago. My wife, Eleanor, asked for something like it long before I was wise enough to listen. I will not make her memory do the work I failed to do while she was alive, so I will say it plainly. We wasted food because it was easier than changing procedures. We ignored good suggestions because they came from people without the right titles. That ends now. The room stayed quiet. Charles glanced at Reverend Green. "Reverend." The older man stepped forward, adjusted the microphone downward, and looked at the hotel staff before he looked at the cameras. "I run a church basement kitchen," he said. "We are not fancy. We have 2 refrigerators that complain. 1 coffee urn older than some of your managers, and volunteers who will tell you exactly when your containers are hard to stack. We also have people at our doors every night who are not statistics. They are retired bus drivers, widows, veterans, hotel workers between paychecks, and grandparents raising children on checks that do not stretch." Annie thought of Mr. Samuel, Mrs. Clara, Old Ben, and Grandma Rose. Reverend Green continued, "Food recovery is not charity theater. It is discipline. It means someone in the kitchen checks temperature when everyone wants to go home. It means a driver shows up when it rains. It means a manager signs a log instead of making excuses. If you are joining this program for applause, you will get tired fast. If you are joining because people should eat, we can work together." Elaine leaned toward Denise and whispered something Annie could not hear. Denise smiled. The training began after the announcement. Staff broke into groups: kitchen handling, labeling, pickup coordination, storage safety, partner communication, and employee reporting. Annie had been assigned to observe the event design side, but Margaret handed her a clipboard. "You see that table near the containers?" Margaret said. "It looks like an afterthought." Annie looked. The materials table had labels, markers, gloves, logs, and delivery sheets spread unevenly across a white cloth. Volunteers kept reaching over one another. "It needs zones," Annie said. "Then fix it." Annie blinked. "Now?" "That is generally when fixing helps." Annie crossed the room and began moving items. Gloves and hairnets on the left. Labels beside containers. Markers tied with string so they would not disappear. Logs at the end where the person checking the boxes could sign without blocking the line. She folded the cloth under at the corners so no one would catch a hip on it. It was a small thing, but the line began moving faster almost immediately. A kitchen supervisor noticed. "Who set this up?" Annie hesitated. "I just moved it around." "Good, leave it that way." Margaret, watching from across the room, did not smile too much. That was how Annie knew she was pleased. Near noon, Tessa entered the hall with a folder tucked under her arm. Annie saw her pause at the entrance, taking in the photograph of Eleanor, the reporters, the community partners, the staff moving through training stations. For once, Tessa did not have a ready comment. She approached the materials table. "This was yours?" Tessa asked. "The layout?" "Yes. Margaret told me to fix it." Tessa looked at the clean flow of boxes and labels. "It works." Annie waited for the sting that usually followed. It did not come. Tessa shifted the folder in her arms. "I was out of line the other day." Annie kept her face still. "Which day?" Tessa's mouth tightened, but not with anger this time. "Fair." Annie looked down at the clipboard. "I'm not trying to take anybody's place." "I know," Tessa said after a moment. "I think I was afraid you would prove I hadn't earned mine as much as I thought." That was more honesty than Annie expected. "I'm just trying to learn," Annie said. Tessa nodded. "Then I'll try not to be in the way." It was not friendship. It was not even trust. But it was the first sentence between them that did not leave Annie feeling smaller. Across the hall, Charles watched the exchange without interrupting. Elaine stepped beside him. "You look like a man trying not to interfere," she said. "I am." "Good. Keep doing that." He glanced toward the training stations. "Is it working?" "It is beginning. That is all you get today." The first official pickup under the Eleanor Table program took place that evening after a corporate dinner for a regional medical association. Annie stayed late with Margaret's permission, though she was careful to record her hours. The kitchen moved differently now, not perfectly, but with intention. Trays were separated before they cooled too long. Containers were filled and labeled. A supervisor checked the log twice. A driver named Rick complained that the route sheet was confusing until Reverend Green's volunteer, a 72-year-old woman named Miss Janet, told him, "Baby, if I can read my prescription bottles, you can read that clipboard." Rick read the clipboard. Annie helped carry the final boxes to the service entrance. Cold air rushed in when the door opened. This time the food did not leave hidden under her coat. It left stacked in clean containers, recorded, expected, and headed toward people who would be called by name when they arrived. Charles stood near the loading area, out of the way. Reverend Green signed the pickup sheet and handed the pen back. "First official run," he said. Charles nodded. "How many meals?" 83 tonight if my volunteers don't eat the biscuits on the drive." Miss Janet called from the van. "I heard that, Reverend." Annie laughed before she could stop herself. Charles looked over. "Miss Brooks, would you like to ride along?" Annie glanced at Margaret. Margaret checked her watch. "Your shift ended 12 minutes ago. I can clock out." "That was not my concern." Annie understood. "I want to go." Margaret nodded. "Then go." The ride to Street Marks was crowded and warm. The van smelling of bread, chicken, green beans, and coffee from Miss Janet's travel mug. Reverend Green sat up front giving directions nobody needed. Annie sat in the back beside the boxes, one hand steadying the stack when the van turned. At the church basement, people were already waiting. Not a crowd, not a scene. Just men and women coming in from the cold, shaking rain from coats, greeting volunteers, asking who had seen whom. Mr. Samuel sat near a heater with a paper cup in both hands. Mrs. Clara had a blanket over her knees. Old Ben stood by the door pretending not to watch for Annie. When she stepped in, Mrs. Clara's face changed. "Well, look at you," she said, "coming through the front with dinner like you own the place." Annie set down a container. "I definitely do not own the place." "No," old Ben said. "But you brought the cavalry." Mr. Samuel laughed, then coughed into his sleeve. "About time the cavalry learned to label chicken." Annie smiled. "It's on the side." The meal service began. Volunteers moved down the line. Food that might have filled a dumpster now filled plates. Annie watched Mrs. Clara take a warm roll and hold it for a second before eating, as if blessing did not always require words. Reverend Green came to stand beside Annie. "You all right?" "Yes, sir." "You look like somebody who expected to feel happy and found something heavier." She looked at the room. "It helps, but it doesn't erase the nights before." "No," he said. "Feeding people tonight does not excuse who went hungry yesterday. It just means yesterday does not get the last word." Annie let that settle. Later, when the van returned to the hotel, Charles was still there. speaking with Denise near the loading dock. He turned when Annie stepped out. "How was it?" he asked. Annie thought of the bus shelter, the wedding hall, the first time Victor had said thief, the way Mrs. Clara had held the role. "It was organized," she said. Charles looked surprised, then nodded. "Good. And it mattered." His face softened a little. "Better." Annie adjusted the strap of her bag, but Reverend Green said something you should probably remember. Charles waited. He said, "People don't eat promises." Charles looked toward the van, then at the staff cleaning the containers for the next run. "Then we will have to keep showing up." Annie nodded. For once, she did not feel the need to say, "Thank you." This was not a favor handed down to her. It was a responsibility finally being carried by the people who should have carried it all along. When she got home that night, her room was cold, and the radiator was knocking again. She took out her sketchbook and drew a long table, not fancy, not decorated for a wedding, just strong enough to hold bread, soup, names, and second chances. Under it, she wrote, "A table is not generous because it is full. It is generous because someone is invited to sit." 3 weeks after the first official food run, Annie stopped counting how many times a day she heard Eleanor's name. It appeared on labels, training sheets, pickup forms, and the small sign now posted near the kitchen exit. The Eleanor Table Program. Safe food. Same night. No waste without review. At first, the sign made her think of the wedding hall, and Victor's finger pointed at her face. Now it made her think of Mrs. Clara sitting in the church basement with a warm roll in both hands, saying grace under her breath while pretending she had not cried. The program was no longer smooth only because important people wanted it to look smooth. It was becoming work. Real work. Drivers forgot routes and had to be corrected. Cooks argued about what counted as safe. Volunteers complained about containers that leaked. Reverend Green called twice in 1 week to say a pickup had arrived late, and hungry people do not become less hungry because a hotel had a scheduling conflict. Denise put that quote on a training slide. Charles approved it without changing a word. Annie watched all of it from the edge of her new life. During the day, she worked under Margaret. She learned how to build a color board that did not look like a craft project, how to read a room diagram, how to steam linen without leaving watermarks, how to say, "That may not serve the design," when a client wanted too many ideas at once. At night, twice a week, she attended class again. The first evening she returned to Atlanta Community Arts College. She stood outside the classroom door for nearly 5 minutes. Inside, students laughed over paper cups of coffee and unrolled sketches across tables. Some were her age. Some looked younger. None of them seemed to carry the same weight in their shoulders. Annie almost turned around. Then Mrs. Clara's voice came back to her from the bus shelter. "Hands that only scrub forget what they were made for." Annie went in. The instructor, Miss Alvarez, looked up from the front desk. "You must be Annie Brooks." "Yes, ma'am." "Welcome back." Back. The word hit harder than welcome. Annie took a seat near the side wall and placed her sketchbook on the table. For the first half hour, she barely spoke. The assignment was to design a garment inspired by a personal memory, without making it literal. A few students sketched prom dresses, vacation clothes, a jacket based on a grandfather's old baseball team. Annie opened to the hidden pocket dress and stared at the pale blue stitching until the lines blurred. Miss Alvarez walked by and paused. "May I?" Annie nodded. The teacher studied the drawing. "Who is it for?" "My grandmother," Annie said. "Or maybe about her." "I don't know yet." "What did she give you?" Annie looked at the pocket hidden in the skirt. "A place to keep going." Miss Alvarez rested one hand on the back of the chair. "Then design that." The word stayed with Annie all week. On Thursday, Margaret handed her a small assignment for an upcoming anniversary dinner. Client wants warmth, dignity, nothing flashy. Married 50 years. Church people. Grandchildren, paying for it. Annie reviewed the notes. Budget? Modest. Color preferences? Cream, blue, and whatever the grandmother called not too much fuss. Annie smiled before she could stop herself. Margaret saw it. "Something useful?" "My grandmother hated fuss. She said if people noticed the decorations before they noticed each other, the room had failed." Margaret pointed at the file. "Then make the room succeed." Annie spent the afternoon building a simple design. Cream linens, low bowls of white carnations and blue delphinium, warm candles in glass, handwritten place cards with space for family notes on the back. Nothing expensive, nothing loud, but when she placed the mock setting under warm light, even Tessa paused beside it. "That's yours?" Annie braced herself. "Yes." Tessa looked at the table a moment longer. "It feels like Sunday dinner after church." Annie did not know whether that was good. Margaret answered from across the room. "That is exactly why it works." Tessa nodded once and walked away. The anniversary dinner took place the following Saturday. Annie was allowed to help with setup, not as cleanup, not as a spare pair of hands pulled from the bottom of the schedule, but as part of the design team. She pinned the final ribbon around the guest book table and adjusted the candles before the family arrived. The couple, Mr. and Mrs. Patterson, came in slowly, arm in arm. Mr. Patterson wore a dark suit and walked with a cane. Mrs. Patterson wore a blue dress and white gloves, the kind Annie had seen older women keep carefully wrapped in tissue paper for church occasions. When Mrs. Patterson saw the place cards with blank backs, she looked confused. Annie stepped forward before fear could stop her. "Ma'am, the family can write a memory on the back of each card before dinner. Then you'll have them to take home." Mrs. Patterson touched one card with the tip of her glove. "Whose idea was that?" Annie glanced at Margaret. Margaret did not rescue her. "Mine, Mum." Mrs. Patterson looked at her. "That is a kind idea. Kind. Not impressive. Not fancy. Kind." Annie decided she liked that better. After the guests sat down, Annie remained near the service corridor with Margaret, checking the room as staff brought out dinner. She watched grandchildren write quickly on cards, cousins pass pens, an older son wipe his eyes before hiding the card under his plate. The room did not look expensive. It looked remembered. Margaret stood beside her. "You understand emotional function. What does that mean?" "It means you know design is not decoration. It is guidance. You guide people toward what matters." Annie let that settle. "Can that be taught?" "Some of it, not all." Later, while the Patterson family ate, the kitchen packaged safe leftovers from another event down the hall. The Eleanor Table pickup van arrived on time. Annie saw Miss Janet at the service door with her clipboard and winter hat pulled low. "You working both miracles and place cards now?" Miss Janet asked. "Mostly place cards. Miracles are paperwork anyway." Annie laughed and helped carry 2 labeled containers to the cart. As she turned back toward the hallway, she saw Charles standing near the loading dock. He had come from another meeting and was speaking with Reverend Green. He noticed Annie and nodded, not calling her over, not making her a symbol in front of anyone, just acknowledging her. That mattered more than she expected. Reverend Green walked over after Charles left. "Mr. Samuel asked about you. How is he?" "Complaining about his antibiotics, which means they are helping." "Mrs. Clara? Running the blanket table like she owns street marks." "She probably does by now." "And old Ben," the Reverend said, "has agreed to help unload the van if we stop calling it volunteering." "What does he call it?" "Keeping fools from dropping soup." Annie smiled. "That sounds right." The Reverend studied her for a moment. "You look less cold." "I'm inside more." "That's not what I meant." Annie looked down at her hands. There were still rough spots, still tiny cuts from pins and paper, but there was pencil dust under one fingernail now. "I don't know what I am yet." "At 18, you are not supposed to. Feels like everyone else knows." "No," Reverend Green said. "Most people are just louder about pretending." That evening, after the anniversary dinner ended, Margaret let Annie take home one of the unused place cards. Not leftovers from a plate, not something rescued from trash. A clean card with a blue border, blank on both sides. At home, Annie placed it on her table beside Grandma Rose's sewing tin. She thought about the assignment from class. Design a garment inspired by a personal memory. Not literal, not costume. Something that carried truth without shouting it. She opened her sketchbook and redrew the hidden pocket dress, this time changing the skirt. The pocket stayed, but now the inside lining carried small embroidered shapes. A roll of thread, a bus stop sign, a table, a folded napkin, a tiny loaf of bread, a rose. Then she took the blank place card and wrote on one side, "For Grandma Rose." On the other side, after a long pause, she wrote, "I am making it back, but not alone." She set the card inside the sewing tin with the $5 bill. The room was still small, the radiator still knocked, rent still mattered. The future still scared her if she looked too far ahead. But on the table in front of her were drawings for class, notes from work, Margaret's corrections, Denise's card, and a place card from a room she had helped make kind. For the first time, Annie did not feel as if she were sneaking pieces of a life from places that did not want her. She was building one in the open. The first real test of the Eleanor Table program came on a Friday night in February, when all 3 ballrooms were booked. Ballroom A held a law firm awards dinner with prime rib, roasted vegetables, and enough untouched rolls to fill 2 bakery racks. Ballroom B hosted a winter wedding with chicken, salmon, fruit trays, and a dessert table that looked as if no one had wanted to be the first to disturb it. Ballroom C belonged to a medical conference where half the guests left early for flights, leaving sealed boxed meals stacked behind the service curtain. By 8:30, the kitchen had become a place of movement and clipped voices. Chefs called for trays. Servers carried plates. Drivers checked pickup times. Volunteers from street. Marks waited near the loading dock with carts and gloves. Denise moved between stations with a clipboard, calm on the outside and ruthless about details. Labels before lids, she told one-line cook. He frowned. Does it matter? It matters when somebody at the church needs to know whether that chicken has been out 20 minutes or 2 hours. He labeled the container. Annie was supposed to be helping Margaret with the wedding teardown plan in Ballroom B, but Margaret had sent her to the service corridor to check linen colors for the next morning's brunch. From there, Annie saw the program begin to strain. One cart had the wrong destination sheet. Another was missing time labels. A tray of salmon sat too close to a warming unit, after it had already been cleared for packing. Rick, the driver, stood near the dock looking at 2 clipboards as if one of them had personally insulted him. "This route says street marks first," he said. Miss Janet, wearing a yellow knit hat and holding her own clipboard, pointed with her pen. "Because street marks closes intake at 10. Then why does this one say Juniper Street Senior Center first?" "Because that one is wrong." Rick looked toward the kitchen. "Who printed it?" "Somebody who ain't driving in the rain," Miss Janet said. Annie stepped closer before she thought better of it. "May I see both?" Rick handed her the clipboards. Miss Janet studied Annie over the top of her glasses but did not object. Annie compared the lists. Street marks had hot meal service until 10. Juniper Street Senior Center had refrigeration and staff until 11. The women's shelter had requested boxed meals only and could accept later. The problem was not the food. It was the order. "This route should go street marks, women's shelter, then Juniper," Annie said. "The boxed meals can ride longer. The hot pans shouldn't." Rick blinked. "You dispatch now?" "No," Annie said. "I read the Times." Miss Janet smiled. "Lord, a miracle." Denise arrived as Annie was rewriting the delivery order on a clean sheet. "What happened?" "Wrong route," Annie said. "I think this fixes it, but you should check." Denise checked. "It does. Like model, fine be me." Miss Janet took the corrected sheet. "Baby, don't say fine like you discovered cooperation." Denise looked at Annie. "Can you stay here 10 minutes? I'm supposed to be with Margaret." "I'll call her." Margaret appeared before Denise could dial. She took in the carts, clipboards, labels, and Annie holding a marker. "I wondered where my apprentice went." "I can come back." Margaret looked at the corrected route. "No. Finish what you started. Design is flow. This is flow with chicken." Annie stayed. For the next half hour, she did not decorate anything. She moved tape, separated pens, wrote larger destination cards, tied blue ribbon around street, marks carts because someone had run out of colored tags, and placed boxed meals on a lower shelf so they would not crush the pastries. It was practical, plain work. But she could feel what Margaret meant. A room, a table, a delivery line, a life. All of them changed when people could move through without being blocked. At 9:15, Charles arrived at the loading dock with Reverend Green. He had come from a board dinner upstairs, still in his suit, his tie loosened slightly. He stopped when he saw Annie directing Rick toward the correct cart. "Street marks first," Annie said. "Women's shelter second. Juniper last." And those 2 containers need new labels because the marker smeared. Rick looked at Charles, as if hoping the boss would rescue him from being instructed by an 18-year-old apprentice. Charles only said, "Do what Miss Brooks says." Rick picked up the labels. Reverend Green laughed under his breath. "That young lady has more sense than 3 committees." Annie heard him and tried not to smile. The first van pulled out at 9:30, then the second. Rain hit the pavement in thin silver lines under the dock lights. The last cart left with Miss Janet seated beside the driver, guarding the pastries as if they were church funds. Denise exhaled. 80. 6 meals from Ballroom A. 112 from B. 40 boxed from C. Reverend Green nodded. "That will carry 3 rooms tonight." Charles looked at Annie. "You saw the problem before we did. I was just standing closer." "No," Margaret said from behind her. "You were paying attention. There is a difference." Annie had no answer for that. Later that night, Margaret asked her to ride along to Juniper Street Senior Center. "Not as a volunteer," she said, "as part of learning the full process. Design does not end at the edge of the ballroom." The senior center sat in a low brick building near a laundromat and a tax office. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed over folding tables. But someone had taped paper hearts to the walls for Valentine's Day. Older men and women sat with coats still on, some talking, some quiet, some watching the door the way hungry people watch doors. Annie helped carry boxes into the kitchen. A woman named Mrs. Leona, who ran the center, checked the labels and nodded. "This is better than last time. Bigger writing. My eyes are 70. 2 years old. Don't make me solve a puzzle before supper." "That was Annie," Margaret said. Mrs. Leona looked at her. "Then Annie can come back." As plates began moving down the tables, an elderly man in a falcon's cap opened one boxed meal and stared at it. "This came from one of those hotels downtown?" "Yes, sir," a volunteer said. He shook his head. "Ate at one once. 1,970. 8. Drove a shuttle there. Couldn't afford the coffee." The woman beside him patted his arm. "Well, tonight you got their chicken. About time," he said and smiled. Annie stepped back into the hallway. For a moment, she had to breathe through the tightness in her chest. These were not dramatic rescues. No one stood on a stage. No one gasped. People simply received food while it was still good, at tables where they did not have to pretend hunger was their fault. Margaret joined her. "Too much?" "No." Annie wiped at one eye quickly. "It's just different when you see where it lands. That is why you needed to see it. I used to think design was about making things beautiful. It is. But this..." Annie looked back into the room. "This is about not making people feel forgotten." Margaret nodded. "The best rooms do that too." On the drive back, Margaret said little. Annie appreciated the quiet. She watched wet streets pass under traffic lights and thought about Grandma Rose sewing late at night. About Mrs. Clara's shaking hands. About Eleanor Whitaker's name printed on food labels in black ink. The next week, the company board held a review of the program. Annie was not supposed to attend, but Charles asked Margaret whether one of the design staff could present the service flow changes made at the loading dock. Margaret sent Annie. "I can't present to the board," Annie said. "You can explain a table and 3 carts. That's not the board. It is if the board is in the room." Annie stood in front of 12 people in suits with a diagram she had drawn herself. Her voice shook for the first minute, then steadied when she stopped looking at their titles and started looking at the paper. "The issue was that the route sheet did not match the food type," she said. "Hot food and boxed meals were treated the same. They are not the same. Once we separated by time sensitivity, the route made sense. Also, the labels were too small for volunteers working fast, especially older volunteers. Larger labels reduced questions." One board member, a gray-haired man with a gold watch, leaned back. "And this is the apprentice?" Margaret answered before Annie could. "This is Miss Brooks." Charles looked at the board member until he corrected himself. "Miss Brooks," the man said. Annie continued. After the meeting, Charles walked beside her to the elevator. "You did well," he said. "I forgot one point. Everyone forgets one point. Do you?" "Sometimes I forget 3 and pretend they were not important." Annie glanced at him and realized he was trying to make her less nervous, not make himself charming. That distinction mattered. At the elevator, Charles said, "My wife Would have liked your label system. Annie looked down at the folder in her hands. Because it worked? Because it considered the person reading it. The elevator doors opened. Annie stepped inside, then turned back. Mr. Whitaker? Yes? Did Mrs. Whitaker like blue? Charles paused. Very much. Annie nodded. I thought so. The doors closed before he could ask what she meant. That night, Annie went home and opened the sketch of the hidden pocket dress. Along the inside lining, where she had drawn thread, bread, a bus stop sign, and a table, she added one more detail. A small food label with clear letters. Tied with a pale blue ribbon, under the drawing she wrote, "Kindness must be organized, or it will arrive too late." By spring, the hotel no longer felt like one building to Annie. It felt like several lives stacked inside the same walls. There was the front lobby, where guests arrived with rolling suitcases and questions about dinner reservations. There were the ballrooms, where strangers became husbands and wives. Companies gave awards to men who already had plaques, and grandmothers saved the flowers from centerpieces because waste offended them. There were the service corridors, where staff moved faster than guests ever knew, and there was the loading dock, where food now left in labeled containers instead of black trash bags. Annie had learned the shape of all of it. She still made mistakes. She ordered the wrong shade of ribbon once and spent 2 hours helping Margaret fix the table samples before a bride arrived. She mislabeled a fabric swatch and got a lecture from June about the moral danger of almost ivory. She cried once in the restroom after a client snapped her fingers to get Annie's attention, then came back out, washed her hands, and finished the mock-up. Margaret said nothing about the tears, only handed her a pencil and said, "Next time, do not reward rudeness by rushing." At school, Miss Alvarez approved Annie's final project, a wedding dress inspired by memory, hunger, and women who made something out of almost nothing. Annie worked on it at night, sitting at her small table with Grandma Rose's sewing tin open beside her. The dress was not grand. It had a simple bodice, soft sleeves, and a skirt that moved easily. Inside the skirt, hidden where only the wearer would know, was a pocket. Along the lining, Annie embroidered small shapes in pale blue thread, a spool, a bus stop sign, a loaf of bread, a folding table, a food label, a rose, and one tiny window with a light on. She called it the shared table. The name came from Eleanor's old proposal, the one Denise had found in the archives. Charles had shown it to Annie one afternoon after a staff meeting, not as a business document but as something he had once failed to protect. "My wife wrote this before she got sick," he said, placing the folder on the table between them. Annie read the title. "The Shared Table Project." "She was ahead of you," Annie said before she could stop herself. Charles gave a tired smile. She usually was. Annie expected him to take the folder back, but he did not. "You should keep a copy," he said. "Why?" "Because you understood it before I did." Annie looked at him, unsure how to answer. Praise still made her want to step aside and let it pass. But she was learning not to disappear from every good sentence. "Thank you," she said. The final exhibition at Atlanta Community Arts College took place on a Thursday evening in May. It was small, held in a campus gallery with white walls, folding chairs, and lights that buzzed softly overhead. Students stood beside their work while families took pictures. Someone's uncle complained that parking cost too much. A little boy touched a mannequin and was pulled back by his mother. The room smelled faintly of coffee, perfume, and nervous ambition. Annie arrived early with Margaret, who helped her adjust the dress on the form. "The hem is breathing now," Margaret said. Annie remembered the first thing Margaret had ever told her. "Took long enough. Most breathing does." June came with a small sewing kit in her purse, in case youth made a bad decision. Luis and Priya arrived together, arguing about whether the gallery lighting was disrespectful to fabric. Denise came straight from work, still wearing her badge. Reverend Green came with Mrs. Clara on his arm. Mr. Samuel followed slowly with a cane, complaining that the college hallway was longer than scripture. Old Ben came last, wearing a clean jacket and pretending he had not polished his shoes. Annie stared when she saw them. Mrs. Clara looked at the dress and put one hand to her mouth. "Baby." "It's not finished perfect," Annie said quickly. Old Ben grunted. "Nothing perfect is useful." Mr. Samuel leaned close to the lining, squinting. "That's a bus stop?" "Yes, sir. Looks better than the real one." Mrs. Clara touched the air near the pocket but did not touch the fabric. Your grandmother would have stood right here and told everybody she taught you everything. She would have, Annie said, and laughed before the tears came. Then Charles arrived. He came alone, without a photographer, without Martin at his shoulder, without any of the distance that usually followed him. He wore a dark suit and carried something small in one hand. He stopped in front of the dress and read the card Annie had placed beside it. The shared table. Designed by Annie Brooks. For every woman who gave away the last piece of bread and called it love. Charles did not speak for a long time. Annie stood beside him, aware of the others giving them space without moving too far away. I never got to design anything for my grandmother, she said. Charles looked at the dress, then at the pale blue shapes hidden inside the lining. Maybe you just did. The words were gentle, but they reached a place in Annie that had been waiting a long time to be seen. She nodded, afraid that if she spoke, the room would blur. Charles held out the small object in his hand. It was a folded piece of paper in a clear sleeve. Annie recognized it. The torn edge. The brown paper. The bag, she said. Yes. Why did you bring it? I thought it belonged with tonight, not as shame, as proof that a thing can be misunderstood at first and still become part of the truth. Annie took it carefully. For months, that bag had lived in her memory, as the thing Victor used to accuse her. Now it felt different in her hand. Thin, ordinary, almost fragile. She placed it beside the dress card. Mrs. Clara nodded once, as if that was exactly where it should go. Miss Alvarez came over with 2 guests from the department and asked Annie to speak briefly about the design. Annie's first instinct was to say no. Then she looked at the people gathered there. Margaret, who had demanded skill instead of gratitude. Denise, who had protected her name. Reverend Green, who knew promises did not feed anyone. Charles, who had arrived late but stayed. And the 3 people from the bus stop, no longer outside the story. Annie stepped beside the dress. This piece is about women who kept people alive quietly, she said. My grandmother did that. She sewed for neighbors, stretched meals, and made me believe a poor room could still have dignity. Mrs. Clara did that for me at a bus stop when she made me eat half a roll I was trying to give away. Eleanor Whitaker did it before I ever knew her name, by believing food and respect should not be wasted. She paused. The room was still. I used to think design was about making beautiful things for people who could afford them. I don't think that anymore. I think design is about making room for memory, for dignity, and sometimes for the people others forgot to invite. No one clapped right away. The silence came first, full and honest. Then Mrs. Clara began, softly, and the others followed. A year after the wedding hall, the Eleanor Table program had expanded to 7 properties. Street Marks was no longer the only partner. Juniper Street Senior Center had added 2 weekly dinners. The women's shelter received boxed meals after conferences. Employees could request food without sneaking, without shame, without being called thieves for needing help. Victor Harlan had disappeared into whatever life waits for men who confuse fear with respect. Annie rarely thought of him now. She still worked. She still studied. She still counted money. But she no longer measured her life, only by what might go wrong before rent was due. After the exhibition, everyone gathered outside the gallery under the warm May evening. Mr. Samuel asked whether artists got free food. Reverend Green told him he had asked the most important question of the night. Old Ben said nothing. But when Annie looked down, he had already taken 2 cookies from the refreshment table and wrapped one in a napkin for later. Charles stood a little apart, watching them. Annie walked over. Your wife would have liked tonight. He looked at her. I hope so. No, Annie said. She would have. Charles smiled then, not the polite smile he wore in business rooms, but something smaller and more tired and more real. Thank you, Annie. For what? For reminding me that grief is not an excuse to stop listening. Annie looked back at the group by the gallery doors. Mrs. Clara was telling Margaret that the dress needed one more hidden pocket. Margaret was listening as if the suggestion deserved serious review. My grandmother used to say people come back to themselves in pieces, Annie said. Charles followed her gaze. She sounds wise. She was bossy. Those often travel together. Annie laughed. Later that night, after everyone left, Annie returned to her rented room and placed the exhibition card inside Grandma Rose's sewing tin beside the $5 bill. Then she set the torn piece of paper bag under the lid. Not hidden, not displayed, just kept. She opened her sketchbook to a clean page and wrote one line before turning out the light. The poorest girl in the room was never the one with the least to give. Outside, Atlanta moved through another night of headlights, late buses, closing kitchens, and people searching for warm places to sit. Somewhere, a van from the hotel pulled up behind street, marks with labeled containers and a driver who now knew the route by heart. Somewhere, Mrs. Clara was probably telling someone that Annie Brooks had made a dress with pockets. Somewhere, Charles Whitaker sat in a quiet house and, for once, let Eleanor's memory open a door instead of closing one. And Annie slept with her sketchbook on the table, no longer afraid that morning would find her empty-handed. The lesson of Annie's story is that kindness is not measured by how much we have, but by what we are willing to notice and protect. A few pieces of leftover food meant nothing to a wealthy room, but to hungry people in the cold, they meant dignity, warmth, and survival. The story reminds us that justice begins when someone refuses to look away. And that real help is not about pity or applause. It is about opening a door, restoring a person's name, and making sure the next Annie does not have to beg for compassion in a world full of abundance. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.